shot by Lennox Lewis.
A right hand by Holyfield.
By Buster Douglas, look at this! He's knocked Mike Tyson down for the first time in his career!
But unfortunately, it'll never happen.
Front punches, and it's over!
I think it's going to be over.
Aguero in big trouble against the ropes.
I have to say there seems an element of genuine hate between these two, Ambrose.
For sure. I don't hate the man.
Just imagine if you bought a ticket. Stop it, Frank. You can stop it anytime.
Castillo's in trouble! Weak steps in, and the fight is over!
Welcome to the Legendary Nights podcast, episode number 10, the finale of season 3, and what a bumper episode we have for you. This is the tale of Jack Dempsey versus Gene Tunney. A hell of a tale about two hell of a fighters with two hell of a stories to go through. We're really excited to do this as the finale. It is a bumper episode, this, Johnston, isn't it? Because there's so much to put context to with both of these fighters. We've never done anything really on these two before. They've only been mentioned in passing in other people's career profiles that we've done, or Legendary Nights, or any of our patron-only episodes that we've done in the past. So this is a great opportunity for us to really present you, the listener, a story about two individuals that left their mark on the sport of boxing. Very excited for this finale. It's a real good one, and I hope everybody enjoys it.
Oh, mate, it's one we've been wanting to do for a very long time, and I'm pleased we finally can get it out. And I think the finale episode for Jack Dempsey and a Gene Tunney legendary night, I think it makes perfect sense. And, you know, as you rightly said, Sean, this is a bumper episode, guys. You know, sit back, enjoy, and listen to a great story about two of the greatest heavyweights ever lived.
And we're going to begin, as we always do, setting context to each individual in this story. And we're going to start with William Harrison Dempsey, or as we know him, Jack Dempsey. Now, he worked in the mines on and off for 5 years while plying his trade as a boxer. At just 19 years old, he was fighting a lot in the amateurs, and he recalled in his own autobiography, "I felt like the best thing for me to do would be to hit other towns, so I hopped a freight and rode the rods into Salt Lake City. There, I decided that my best bet would be to walk into a gym, announce the grand arrival of Kid Blackie, the name he fought under at the time, and add that I was willing to take on anyone." Fighting predominantly in Utah and the surrounding states of Colorado and Nevada, Dempsey had an interesting way of getting fights without a manager. And he recalled that while in Colorado, I got fights by walking into saloons and announcing, with what I hoped was the grandiloquence of the great John L. Sullivan, "I can't sing and I can't dance, but I'll lick any son of a bitch in the house." The more Dempsey knocked out, the more attention he got. One of the opponents he knocked out was Andy Malloy, and he became his first manager. A verbal agreement was always the way Harry did business. "I never signed a contract with any of my managers, not even Kearns. It just didn't seem necessary in those days. A handshake was stronger and more meaningful than any inked signature. The only ingredients necessary were respect and trust." However, their partnership only worked for a brief time because they just couldn't make enough money to make it worthwhile, so they split amicably. Dempsey recalled, "After Andy, I had a succession of business managers, all with very scant business sense. I wasn't happy with any of them, and we always parted company soon after I realised that they were as green and as inexperienced as me."
Well, while Harry, or aka Jack Dempsey, was fighting to make ends meet, James Joseph Tunney, aka Gene Tunney, was taking a different route into boxing. Billy Jacobs, a Sharkey Athletic Club matchmaker situated in Upper Manhattan, heard about a young fighter from Greenwich Village, and he set up a meeting with Tunney and offered him to fight in a 10-round bout. He told Gene Tunney, "No fighter I have ever known has given a star bout for his first professional fight," to which Tunney responded, "Why should I box professionally? I have 2 jobs, both of which are paying me fairly well." Jacobs told him that based on what he had heard about his boxing talent, he could go far in the ring and earn more money than he was making at the Ocean Steamship and as a part-time athletic director at a public school called PS41. Now, Tunney was not convinced, so actually refused the offer, but Jacobs refused to give up on this promising young kid. And he called on Willie Green, a veteran professional lightweight that coached Gene, and Eddie O'Brien, a saloon keeper and occasional boxing trainer. Both knew Gene Tunney and had his respect. Jacobs asked him to convince the hot young prospect that it was in his best interest to turn professional. Green and O'Brien not only convinced Tunney to accept Jacobs' offer, but said that if he did, they would work in his corner for as long as he had liked. O'Brien actually said that there isn't any fighter from this city that ever had such an offer, and you can lick anybody they throw into the ring with you. Tunney was finally convinced, and the $25 to fight professionally, $10 more than his father earned a week on Hudson River piers, was the icing on the cake. His main aim was to earn enough money from boxing so he could focus on his job, which was on the Ocean Steamship, but for now, he had nothing to lose.
Bernie Dempsey was one of Jack Dempsey's brothers and fought under the name Jack Dempsey after the great Irish-born middleweight champion of the 1880s and 1890s, who had been nicknamed the Nonpareil, as in unequalled, which he was as a fighter, having gone unbeaten in his first 62 fights. Bernie was close to 40 and booked in to fight a middleweight named George Copeland in the tough Colorado mining town of Cripple Creek on November the 19th, 1915. But on the day of the fight, he told Harry, then 20, that he could not go on. Bernie told his kid brother, "Harry, I feel terrible. It's the altitude, I think." Harry replied, "Oh, come on, Bernie. Anybody can flatten him." Bernie then snapped and said, "Right then, you flatten him," while suggesting that his younger brother use Bernie's borrowed name to accommodate the promoter. At this point, Harry, who was still fighting professionally as Kid Blackie, became known as Jack Dempsey after stopping Copeland in 7 rounds. Dempsey, who was a 160-pound middleweight, needed a new manager, and he recalled, "I asked Hardy Downing, a local promoter who ran a boxing club, if he knew of anyone. He suggested Jack Price, his brother-in-law. I knew Price slightly and liked him. He was a heavy-set, good-natured guy who was willing to try anything. His ambition was to become a famous dancer in New York. So then I approached him with the offer of becoming my manager and told him that I was thinking of going east." Jack Price was a fringe boxing figure who had managed a few local fighters. Having witnessed Dempsey record many knockouts and was aware of his earlier successes, he guaranteed better opponents, which meant bigger purses, and so they went into partnership.
And even before young Dempsey began to move up in class, he had already moulded himself into an aggressive fighter. Years later, he attributed his low crouch stance to working in the low ceilings in the Colorado mines. He would bob and weave as he constantly stalked his opponents around the ring, and when he had them hurt, he was a ruthless finisher, even this early in his career. When he did face a clever boxer, he never altered his style, always confident of finding that knockout punch. When hurt, Dempsey refused to retreat. If anything, when he was dazed, he would become more dangerous, throwing back harder punches with even more ferocity. It was this style that excited boxing fans, and it was a style, obviously, back in them days, it was very exciting and would lead to him being adored across the country. Not yet, but eventually. But for now, he was an unknown quantity outside of Utah. Now, while Dempsey and Price were having a drink in Salt Lake Bar, Dempsey, who was eager to move on to even bigger things and a bigger level, suggested, "Let's go New York and make some real money." And Price responded, "New York, are you crazy, Harry?" Dempsey said, "They got real fighters there. I'm a real fighter." Well, after a brief thought, Price agreed. "Okay, but I won't ride them damn rods with you," he said. The following day, Dempsey bought his very, very first train ticket and he headed off to the promised land. They arrived in New York during the summer of 1916, and Dempsey was eager to let all the New York sports editors know of his arrival. Although they couldn't have cared less about him whatsoever, they didn't even know who he was. The only writers who actually showed any interest in him was Jim Price of the New York Press, who assigned a young Nat Fleischer, by the way, a big name, but very young and early in his days, to interview Jack for the Sunday edition of the New York Press. He actually wrote a story about Jack Dempsey, which helped to promote him.
Damon Runyon, who had seen Dempsey with the Denver Post journalist Gene Fowler during his fights out west, also took an interest, and he told him not to give up, and the important thing to remember was to keep your mouth shut and never let on to anyone what you really felt deep down inside, since no one really cared or had time to listen. Dempsey was grateful for the advice, saying, "His words meant a lot to me." Around this time, Runyon was just one journalist among many. He didn't become the superb raconteur of Broadway until years later. Runyon then convinced Tom McArdle, a matchmaker and good friend of Billy Gibson, to book Dempsey a fight at the Fairmont Athletic Club. Dempsey's first fight in New York was against Andre Anderson, who came out of the Fairmont Athletic Club and was managed by Tunney's new manager, Gibson, and was 55 pounds heavier than Jack Dempsey. Dempsey's recorded record stood at 21 wins, 18 knockouts, 1 defeat and 5 draws. But he had fought since he was 16 and probably had over 100 fights before the first documented in 1914. Dempsey failed to get the knockout win he desired, but he took a newspaper decision, with one of those sports writers being Damon Runyon, who said that he looked very promising and with the right training and management he could get to the top. Ironically, Dempsey's first 2 fights in New York would be at the Fairmont Athletic Club, where the 19-year-old Tunney was finally catching the eye of some New York boxing writers. He scored another newspaper decision a couple of weeks later against Wild Burt Kenny, for double the money he got in his debut. But after a few days, Jack Price received a wire saying that his mother was gravely ill in Salt Lake City. Price immediately returned home by train, leaving Dempsey without a manager and alone in Manhattan.
Well, Dempsey actually recalled that he said, in a way, I felt he was glad to be going home despite the circumstances. He had been homesick for a long time. We said goodbye and we parted, and we both knew we wouldn't see each other again for a long time. But this was a very interesting twist that Dempsey actually found out sometime later that the telegram that had been sent to Price was actually sent by someone else, to basically just trying to get him out of the way. In stepped this guy. And this guy was John the Barber, real name John Reisler, was described by Dempsey as a slick operator and gambler that many said he would have sold his mother's blood for money if the price was right. There you go, you get the gist of what the Barber was like. He was also famous for matching or mismatching his fighters against far better opponents to ensure a bigger payday. Now, he told Dempsey that he had bought his contract from Price for $50. But Dempsey knew that was bullshit because no contract ever existed then or ever would. His deals were always ever done, as he said earlier, by a handshake. Now, Dempsey protested, but as he recalled, he told me I would fight for him whether I liked it or not. I really didn't have a choice. Now, 2 fighters were offered to him, Gunboat Smith and the 36-year-old and half blind at the time, Sam Langford. But Dempsey, who was not ready for either of them at those time, he refused. He knew who they were, and he was like, I've got no way I'm going to beat these guys. Now, it was suggested that when Dempsey was offered Langford, he actually told Reiser that he'll kill me, you're wasting my time, I won't fight him, he's too damn good for me. Now, Reiser became impatient and told Dempsey, under no uncertain terms, listen, you little punk, I'm giving you one more chance. You fight John Lester Johnson next week. He's good, and that's what you want, right? Now, don't give me any of your lip. If you don't fight him, you fight no one. See, I feared getting blackballed. It could ruin me.
Dempsey took the fight and spent the night before sleeping on a wooden bench in Central Park because Reisler wouldn't advance him any money before the bout. In the second round at the Harlem Sporting Club, Johnson landed a vicious left hook that broke 3 of Dempsey's ribs. Years later, Dempsey said, "It was the hardest punch I ever took, and that includes everybody who ever hit me anytime, anywhere, and with anything. It busted 3 of my ribs like matchsticks." Dempsey resiliently fought on and lasted the 10-round distance, and he remembered, "The sports writers were divided. Some picked Johnson, some picked me, and still others called it a draw. At least I had made a decent showing that night." He then added that the writers who voted for Johnson were half right, and he said, "I wasn't beaten, I was massacred." Now John the Barber, of course, shortchanged Dempsey for his night's work and handed him $35 out of his $85 share, blaming his old manager Price of taking $50 of his cut to get home to his non-sick mother. The fake telegram was sent by none other than John Reisler. Dempsey would be out for a few months after breaking his ribs, so decided to head home to recover. With not enough money to buy a seat home on the train, he climbed under a freight car, positioned himself on several steel rods, and took the long trip back to Salt Lake City with 3 broken ribs and $30 in his pocket to show for it. Now, while Dempsey was finding life as a professional boxer difficult to navigate, Gene Tunney had no such problems, making $17 a week with 2 jobs, one with the Ocean Steam Ship Company, and in the evening working as an athletic director in Greenwich Village. And unlike Dempsey, Tunney, still in his late teens, always had a bed to sleep in at his parents' apartment.
Well, Tunney hadn't fought for 6 months since agreeing to turn professional with Billy Jacobs. He signed to fight against a guy called K.O. Jaff at the Polo Athletic Club in Harlem. Even though he hadn't fought in months, Tunney was developing a following in Greenwich Village and at the Ocean Steamship Company as well, with several hundred of his supporters turning out for the fight on July 21st, 1916, exactly a week after Dempsey's last fight in New York. Fearing he might be rusty after the long layoff, Tunney was superb in his display of defensive mastership boxing. He was, by the sounds of it, great against Jeffy or Jeff, Jafe, or whatever you want to call him. Landed only a few punches as Tunney completely outcast the kid. Now back to Jack Dempsey, who, despite had his broken ribs, was back in the ring 2 months later in Salida, Colorado, where he had been working as a janitor in a brothel run by one of Colorado's best-known madams, Laura Adams. Now, although he was outweighed by about 30 pounds without a manager, Dempsey, now 21, was coming in at 170 pounds by this point, and he flattened his opponent, young Hector, in the 3rd round. He returned home to see his family and resumed his relationship with Maxine Cates, a barroom piano player and prostitute in Salt Lake City, who was 14 years his senior. Now, we will go into her. She come up a little bit later. Now, at her suggestion, they actually got married as well on October the 9th, 1916 in Farmington, Utah. Dempsey actually recalled that she was sweet and friendly when we married, but it didn't last long. Her moods were constant changing and her friendliness turned to hostility once the honeymoon in a tacky hotel room was over. Dempsey went back to mining and did some lumberjacking before giving some money to Maxine and using the rest of it to get back to New York and to pursue his dream of making it big. When he arrived, he was met by none other than John the Barber, and Dempsey said, "Well, here I am. I guess I'm ready to fight again."
He immediately arranged a match, telling Jack, "You may have to take a licking, kid, but there'll be real money in it for you if you do it the way I say." Dempsey recalled, "I don't want that kind of money. I want a good, honest fight. Who's my opponent?" Reisler replied, "Gunboat Smith." Dempsey refused and said, "I won't fight him. I can't fight him. What are you trying to do to me?" Reisler wasn't playing around and said, "You won't fight him, you say? Listen, you punk, it's either him or no one, just like I told you before." After rejecting another fight, Dempsey was threatened. The barber told him, "Either fight this guy or get the hell out of town. If you don't fight, I'll make it impossible for you to fight in this town, or for that matter, any goddamn place else. Dempsey held his own, boarded a train, and headed to Philadelphia, where he couldn't find a fight for love nor money, thanks to the barber. He rode the rods and stopped off in Kansas City, where he began to spar with Carl Morris for a daily pay of 75 cents. It didn't last long. He was back in Salt Lake City before he knew it. After putting away a couple of bodies, Dempsey was offered fireman Jim Flynn in Utah. In desperate need for a fight, he took it, but it ended badly. His brother Bernie threw in the towel in the very first round, which encouraged speculation. Joe Williams, a sports writer for the newspaper Enterprise Association, wrote that Dempsey had laid down, as the boys say. I understand he got $300 for taking a synthetic belt on the whiskers, and that he carried the money tucked away inside his trunks when he entered the ring.
Well, if that is true, I don't blame him, to be quite honest with you. I would have taken a fight for that money, 100% in the position he was in, but the rumour of the fix was never confirmed, and Dempsey certainly never admitted it. He said that he fell out with his brother because he was disappointed that he wasn't given a chance to fight on. After the fight, he did try to patch things up with his estranged wife, Maxine, but she disappeared without a trace. Now, following a disappointing loss to fireman Flynn, Dempsey fought to a draw with Al Norton twice and knocked him out in California in the summer of 1917. He also fought Willie Meehan 6 times in all, losing points twice, drawing twice, and beating him twice, knocking him out in the first round in California on September the 19th, 1917. But how did Dempsey come to arrive in California? Well, it started out with a bar fight. Now, he had nothing to do with it, but found himself in the middle of it. And Dempsey ended up laying out a few guys who were actually picking on a smaller man. And he legged it for the police. He then received a distress wire from his mum, notifying him that his brother Bruce had been stabbed. And by the time he actually reached home after riding the rods, it was too late. His brother had died from his injuries. Dempsey was as low as he had ever been. But then his boxing fairy tale turned into reality. He received a letter from Jack Kearns. It said that it took a tough man to take on tough opponents and win. He said he had seen him fight, liked what he saw, and was interested in becoming his manager if things worked out, if he was interested. Dempsey wrote back immediately, telling him that he was interested and available, clearly, obviously well up for it. The return letter finally arrived. He was waiting ages for it, from Kearns, who sent Dempsey a railroad ticket from Salt Lake City to San Francisco and also a bit of money to eat.
Dempsey recalled, I couldn't believe it. Here was a guy I had never met sending me $5 and a ticket. This Kearns, as far as I was concerned, had class. He said his goodbyes to the family, left for the station, and climbed into a passenger seat on the train rather than riding under one. Kearns met him at the station, and would you believe it? It was the same small guy he had helped in the barroom brawl in Oakland. For both at this point, nothing was going right, so their venture was a complete gamble. But boy did it pay off. Now moving back to Gene Tunney, who, after having fought only once in 1916 on July 21st, made up for it in the December, fighting 4 times, knocking out 3 and outpointing the other, all in New York, in just 3 weeks. But Tunney's life took a diversion at this point, when Congress, at the urging of President Woodrow Wilson, declared war on Germany on April the 6th, 1917. Gene Tunney, about to turn 20, saw a Marine recruiting poster that read, Marines always first to fight, which convinced him that he wanted to be a Marine. Without telling anyone, he went to a Marine recruiting station in Union Square, Lower Manhattan, on May the 10th to enlist. But he was rejected on the grounds that his left arm was partially paralysed. Tunney had sustained an injury to his left elbow during a basketball game, which was put in plaster for 5 weeks. When the cast was removed, his left arm had weakened and was shorter than his right. After seeking advice from 2 doctors and using all types of different remedies to help his arm, he was advised to take a more physical job to build up the strength of his weakened arm.
So Tunney reluctantly quit his well-paid jobs and worked in the day as a lifeguard at one of the swimming pools locally, and at nights as a bouncer at a local tavern. Now, when both of those jobs actually came to an end and he was actually unable to get his old job back, his favourite job, which was on the ship, so he decided to return to the ring. And in his first fight in 8 months, his left arm still not in the best of shapes and a lack of adequate training, he started off 1918 with a second round knockout with his left hook, funny enough, demonstrating that his left arm was actually starting to get better. He took home $40, the equivalent of about $200 today, but he felt guilty that he was earning more money than most servicemen. So he decided to quit boxing again, wait for his elbow to heal, and then enlist again, or try to enlist in the Marines. He got another job working on the Hudson River waterfront and kept his night job as an athletic instructor at the PS41 in Greenwich Village. Tunney's arm problem was diagnosed by a specialist muscle doctor as traumatic neuritis, and after 5 months of weekly treatments, he cured the problem with an electronically operated therapeutic device that the doctor had actually invented himself. Assured by the doctor that he was now certain to pass the Marine physical test, Tunney returned to Union Square Marine recruiting station on July the 17th and passed the physical examination. He was sworn in as a $15 a month United States Marine and was told to report for duty the next day. Tunney, who was unbeaten in 14 fights, put boxing behind him and had no intention to box while in the Marines. What he thought was quickly put to bed one day, because while he was in the Marines, a sergeant began to taunt Tunney in front of the recruits. Tunney was quite shy and he refused to show his boxing skills, so he remained silent through the talks and the insults.
Finally, the sergeant went too far and Tunney responded, "Sergeant, nobody can call me that in fun or in earnest. I'm ready to fight you any time you say." The sergeant happily replied, "Fine, Private, I'll see you after the drill." Later, the recruits gathered in a circle, and Tunney, after watching the sergeant box before, knew what to expect. Tunney, who weighed 155 pounds, was outweighed by about 25 pounds, ducked and weaved until finally he unloaded a left hook that caught the sergeant flush on the jaw and rendered him unconscious. The recruits cheered in disbelief. Tunney said, "When he came to, we shook hands and we became friends. He was still the sergeant, old and experienced, and I was a rookie. The victory made him the boxer at Paris Island." Now back to the two Jacks, Dempsey and Kearns, who had found a mutual respect from the very beginning, so much so that he let Dempsey stay with him at his mum's house so he could rest and eat before they then began their surge on the heavyweight crown. Dempsey described Kearns as a jack of all trades, a gold weigher in a saloon, wrestler, fighter, unsuccessful peddler of cemetery plots and door-to-door Bible salesman, not to mention gambler, and now a boxing manager. But his Achilles heel was the booze. He drank a lot of the time. At Kearns' mother's house, he assembled a makeshift ring to get Dempsey in fighting shape, and he even got his old fighter Marty Farrell to come over and spar with him. Kearns gradually got Dempsey ready by getting him those fights with Al Norton and Willie Meehan. It was all part of the bigger picture, with the end sight being about with the hard-hitting Gunboat Smith, who he felt he was now ready for.
Now, the Smith fight was tough going and went the 4-round distance, but Dempsey wasn't happy with his performance, and he recalled saying in the dressing room, "I guess I'm no match for Gunboat. I'm real sorry I let you down. I guess I'm not what I thought I was." Kearns then told Dempsey, "Kid, you won. The Gunboat hit you with a right, and I thought it killed you, but you nearly killed him." Spider Kelly, who was in his corner that night with Kearns, then told him, "You're in, kid. You're in. What the hell are you apologising for? Save that for Gunboat, kid. You're going to be the next champion." Exhausted and overwhelmed, Dempsey passed out. It was after the Gunboat Smith fight that Dempsey's career took a dramatic U-turn into skinny wretch that no one thought would make a potential contender, let alone anything else. Jack Kearns also got the nickname from Jack Dempsey, so everyone called him Jack Kearns, That was his real name. But his nickname was Doc. It was Dempsey that coined it when he got into the habit of always saying, whatever you decide is okay with me, you're the doctor. So that's why he called him Doc. The nickname stuck, and through the years, Dempsey always addressed him as Doc. That wasn't the only nickname that was created. After the Gunboat Smith victory, Dempsey would go on an amazing knockout run, which inspired Nat Fleischer to refer to Dempsey as Manasseh Jack. It was then developed by Damon Runyon to the nickname, as we all know him as Manasseh Mauler. That was to stick for the rest of his life, and Dempsey said, I was very proud of it. Dempsey fought 21 times in 1918. He won 20, knocked out 18, 12 in the very first round, lost once to Willie Meehan in that sixth and final fight on points over 4 rounds, and drew with Billy Misk. His last knockout of the year came against that tough opponent he had, Gunboat Smith, in a 2-round destruction in Buffalo, New York.
Dempsey got to show a lot of people that he was without a doubt the most exciting and most devastating young heavyweight around. While continuing to gain publicity and more exposure for his fighter, Kearns and Dempsey bumped into the heavyweight champion, Jess Willard, in the street. Kearns jumped at the opportunity to corner him and push a title defence against Dempsey. However, he said that he would not defend the title until after the war. Kearns then made him promise that he would give Dempsey the first shot when he was ready to fight again. Dempsey recalled that Jess agreed. I think he would have agreed to anything at this point just to get away from Kearns. Doc relaxed and Willard managed to get away fast. After the discussion with Willard, they spoke to Otto Floto of the Denver Post and agreed to print the story and the promise he had made. Now, with Kearns weaving his magic to get Dempsey in the papers and into world title contention, Gene Tunney and his regiment travelled to a French seaport in Brest for 2 weeks, where he had another fight, read Shakespeare, and was on the verge of combat with the Germans. However, they surrendered on November the 11th, 1918. Tunney said in later years the feeling was like that of a fighter who, after training for months for a big bout, suddenly is told that the fight has been called off, showing that he had still had the hunger to go back in the ring after the war.
Well, Tunney, after the Germans obviously surrendered, Tunney returned to base and actually enlisted in a boxing program where he seized an opportunity to fill in for a no-show. Tunney ended up stopping a soldier in 2 rounds to the delight of the Marines and continued to participate in more fights. This eventually led to him knocking out a former professional fighter who outweighed him by about 40 pounds. In doing so, he won the base heavyweight title. Within a matter of months, Tunney's reputation as a fighter had extended to US military posts throughout Europe. He travelled to France and competed in 7 fights, winning all but 1, which ended in a draw. Tunney entered the American Expeditionary Forces, or the AEF, boxing tournament, but despite injuring his right hand, he actually made it through to the semi-final against a veteran professional called K.O. Sullivan, winning all 10 rounds and relying almost entirely on his left jab and a punishing left uppercut. That victory led him to the final of the light heavyweight AEF championship against Ted Jameson, a former amateur champion in the United States, in front of 14,000 at the Crique de Paris Arena on April 26, 1919. Now, despite breaking his hand during the bout, Tunney fought on to the 10th and last round and unloaded a vicious left hook that caught Jameson on the chin and put him down and on the deck. Now, Jameson got up, but a punch along with some masterful boxing by Tunney won him the round, the decision, and the title. When the announcement was made, Tunney stood dazed as his fellow Marines chanted his name, Tunney, Tunney, Tunney. And he said that it was a moment that he would never forget for as long as he lived, and ignited his love for that sport of boxing once again.
Tunney later said this was the moment that he changed his mind about returning to a professional ring, and he said, maybe all of this, winning a tournament I did not want to enter, and with only one good hand at that, was some sort of destiny. Maybe it was meant to convince me that I was destined to be a fighter, after all, and that perhaps I could actually go somewhere in boxing once I get out of the Marines. If I was able to beat some pretty good fighters in the AAF tournament with a broken knuckle on one hand, maybe I could do even better as a professional with two good hands. Certainly, I have nothing to lose trying. While in Paris for the Inter-Allied Games competition, Tunney received staggering news from home that his 19-year-old brother John, who was 3 years younger, had been shot to death in a Manhattan nightclub. Unable to attend the funeral because he was hundreds of miles away, Tunney had to mourn his brother's death alone. Back to Jack Dempsey and his new manager, Doc Kearns, and they bumped into an old acquaintance, a certain John the Barber, who demanded some of the action, even though there wasn't any. Most of it was just a smokescreen to fool anyone watching that they thought they were making more money than what they were. Kearns was all about the image, which got him noticed. He was forced into a corner by the unsavoury former manager Reisler, who said he had a contract with Dempsey, but when Doc asked the Barber to produce the alleged contract, he couldn't. The Barber told Doc that he had advanced Dempsey $5,000, but of course he hadn't. Kearns wasn't stupid and knew it was all bullshit, but he knew he would have to cough up the money or face the consequences.
Well, Kearns managed to convince, great way of convincing people, Kearns, that's for sure. The part owner of the New York Yankees, Colonel Jake Rupert, to bail him out and paid off John the Barber that $5,000. And with him out of the way, they could continue their assault on the heavyweight crown. But first, Dempsey finally got officially divorced with his estranged wife, Maxine. Now, during 1919, Doc Kearns decided that they needed a gimmick to attract attention. So they went on the vaudeville circuit. Doc actually devised an entire stage routine, which included a short workout, some sparring, and then the offer of $1,000 to take on the future heavyweight champion of the world. And this is what Jack Dempsey remembered as well. He said, while the crowd debated the offer, a young man called Max would present himself, shaking with anticipation for the 1,000. With one punch, he would lay down flat. We had practiced our act so many times that his timing was ace perfect. Doc had told Max to make sure he beat everyone else in getting to me. He did, and the audience, well, they ate it up. Now, while making plenty of noise and attracting plenty of attention, Jess Willard was getting more and more frustrated and told one journalist that if he ever met Dempsey in the ring, it would only be because he hadn't been knocked out by some second-rate fighter. Dempsey said that apparently he still felt that my 18-second knockout of Fred Fulton, which was a top contender at the time, had been a fluke. That was the extent of Willard's comment before he dismissed me altogether. He thought I was a jerk, and he considered Doc as a gangster as well as a pain. Doc Kearns' plan was clearly working, but to push the envelope for the Willard fight, he actually met with a certain promoter, a big promoter of the time, Tex Rickard, and convinced him to offer Willard $100,000 to fight Dempsey. The champ responded to Rickard with an answer just a couple of days later, requesting to meet in Chicago.
Willard accepted the offer, but the question now was what cut Dempsey deserved. Tex and Doc argued it out until Kearns suggested that the press help them decide. So, in front of a room full of press a few days later, they thrashed it out. Dempsey recalled, Rickard offered us $25,000. Firm, Doc countered with $30,000. Then it was given to the press to decide. Within 10 minutes, it was settled, $27,500, more money than I had ever been offered in my entire life. Trouble was, now Rickard needed to find a suitable venue and cough up the extra $27,500 to pay for a contender. Doc immediately suggested Toledo, Ohio, and after approval from the governor there, Kearns received $100,000 in cash from Frank Flournoy, who in 1919 became Rickard's partner. In New York, Rickard announced to the press that Toledo, Ohio would be the location for the championship bout. On February the 11th, 1919, on a ferry boat in New Jersey, the contracts were finally signed because it was illegal to sign fight articles in New York. The fight was on. And it was big news, even for Gene Tunney and his friend, a Marine corporal named Jack McReynolds, who had been a sports writer in Kansas City. McReynolds had covered several of Dempsey's fights in the West, and Tunney, like other American servicemen abroad, had begun to hear and read a lot about Dempsey. Tunney asked, "Is he really that good?" McReynolds replied, "He's very good. He'll murder Jess Willard and take the championship when they meet." Tunney persisted, "What's he like?" McReynolds responded, "He's a big Jack Dillon." Now Dillon was known as Jack the Giant Killer. He was an outstanding fighter who had held the light heavyweight title from 1914 until 1916.
Well, Tunney was always the thinking man, and inside and outside the ring, and Tunney knew that Dillon had trouble with skillful boxers like Mike Gibbons and battling Levinsky, who in their 10th meeting had taken away Dillon's title by decision. They continued their conversation, and Tunney inquired. He said, "Then perhaps Dempsey can be beaten by a clever boxer." And McReynolds replied, "Yes, Dempsey can be beaten by speed, defense, and science. When Jack Dempsey loses, it won't be because he's outfought. It's because he's outboxed." And McReynolds, noticing the glint in Tunney's eye, said, "Gene, you're young, you're fast, you're clever. You can take it. It ought to be possible for you to do that someday." Tunney responded, I will. And on July 29th, 1919, 9.5 months after arriving in France, Tunney and more than 3,000 other members of the 11th Regiment east from Brest, France, on a ship arrived in Hampton Roads, Virginia, 9 days later on August the 9th. After almost 2 weeks at the Marine base in Quantico, Tunney was eventually discharged on August the 18th and several hours later boarded a train for the 17-hour ride to Pennsylvania Station in New York. When Tunney left home for the Marines, he was 6 foot tall and weighed 158 pounds. Now, just a year later, he was an inch taller at 6'1" and 17 pounds heavier, and had his mind fixed on getting back to the ring with aspirations of one day winning that heavyweight title. Now, while Tunney was almost restarting his boxing career, Dempsey was about to become as big as other famous sportsmen at the time, Babe Ruth. But to do that, he needed to get past the current heavyweight champion, who was Jess Willard. Dempsey began training in Toledo with his trainer, Jimmy DeForest, way before Willard actually arrived in town. The regime was 1 week of training with 1 week rest.
Dempsey broke down his day-to-day in the lead-up to the fight, and he said 10 miles of jogging, followed by a hot and cold shower and a rub-down until breakfast, which consisted of meat and vegetables. After breakfast, a quick nap, and then off again, sprinting a few miles. I just couldn't believe the crowds that jammed the road to see me. My typical afternoon consisted of exercising and sparring, which could be watched by anyone willing to shell out 2 bits. Afterwards, more sprinting until dinner. No drugs, no drinks, and no women were allowed on campgrounds. Those were the rules. Doc Kearns did all the trash talking for Dempsey, verbally bashing him at every opportunity. It was amusing to the press, who ate it up, but it also removed some of the spotlight from his fighter while preparing for the biggest fight of his life. Dempsey was under no illusions, and he said himself, "I was fully aware that this was my big chance. The spotlight was on me, even though I still stood in Willard's shadow." By the time the fight came around, Dempsey hadn't slept a wink. He was filled with pure adrenaline. He weighed in at 187 pounds, and Jess Willard, the favourite, at 245 pounds. Tex Rickard, who would also be one of the judges, revealed that all the $60 ringside seats were sold, and most of the $50 seats were sold. But the disappointment came from the cheapest tickets, which sold for $10. Provisions had been made to sit between 35,000 and 40,000 in that section, but only about 5,000 seats were sold. As 19,500 arrived in the heat of Bayview Park Arena. Gate receipts were just under $500,000. The city of Toledo earned $28,500 and the promoters made a profit of just over $85,000.
And on July 4th, 1919, in the blazing sun, the first round was shorter than expected. It lasted 2 minutes and 50 seconds because the timekeeper couldn't do his job properly. Dempsey floored Willard 7 times in the first round. While on the deck for the 7th time in a neutral corner, the referee, Ollie Picord, was at the count of 7 when the timekeeper blew the whistle. But because the crowd was so loud, Picord and many others didn't hear it. Picord actually finished the count, waved the fight off, and awarded Dempsey as the winner. Thinking the fight was over, Dempsey actually recalled that I was stunned. Doc rushed up to me, threw his arms tightly around me, and told me to get out of the ring. I did, as people started to climb into the ring. Jimmy told me to move faster. We were by the press seats when Jimmy half turned and saw that the ring was in a state of chaos. Doc, half in and half out of the ropes, was now frantically waving me back. Ollie had told him that the fight wasn't over, and Warren Borber, the official timekeeper, screamed over the confusion that if I didn't get back into the ring, I'd be disqualified. Well, Dempsey did as he was told, and the fight continued. Willard stayed on his feet during rounds 2 and 3, but he continued to take a beating. Willard's corner had seen enough and decided to stop the fight after the 3rd round, which left Willard sat in his corner sobbing. Same sentence. I have $100,000 and a farm in Kansas. I have $100,000 and a farm in Kansas. I think he might have been a bit concussed. Dempsey recounted this joyous moment and he said, I won, my God, I won. I made it, I was the new champion.
William H. Rocap, sports editor of the Philadelphia newspaper, the Public Ledger, wrote, Willard must be labelled a quitter. He has disgraced the sport. Dempsey disagreed. Willard was no quitter. Any man who stood up to take what I had given him was no quitter in my book. The damage that Willard took that night were varied. The ring suggested that he had broken his jaw, suffered multiple facial fractures, several broken ribs and hearing loss in one ear, while the Associated Press reported that descriptions were grossly exaggerated. But the biggest story to come out of this fight was in the 1960s, when shortly before Doc Kearns passed, he approved the final draft of his memoirs, The $1 Million Gate, and secured a deal with Sports Illustrated to publish 2 extracts from the book. One said, he didn't know the gloves were loaded. Kearns claimed that Dempsey's hand wraps were treated with plaster of Paris. Willard later said, they thought it was just a sore loser complaining. I'm glad Kearns finally admitted it. My jaw is still caved in from the beating that fellow gave me with his cement on his hands. Dempsey denied that his gloves were loaded and sued the publishers of Sports Illustrated for $3 million. They finally settled out of court for an undisclosed fee, and Sports Illustrated wrote a statement which read, wholeheartedly accepting Dempsey's denial of the charge of the late Jack Kearns. Now, jumping back in the timeline, and on July the 5th, 1919, the New York Times reported, in the first statement he has made since becoming the World Heavyweight Champion, Jack Dempsey announced today that he would draw the colour line. He will pay no attention to Negro challengers, but will defend his title against any white heavyweight as the occasion demands.
In a little while, we'll get into why he did that, because there were a couple of dangerous black heavyweights around at this time. Now, while Tunney was making his way home, following his discharge from the war, he was on the Hudson River Ferry, travelling from Jersey City to Manhattan, when he spotted the new heavyweight champion of the world, Jack Dempsey. Shocked, he turned to his manager, Billy Roach now at the time, and said, I can't believe it's him. He's been on my mind ever since I won the AEF title. I've got to go over and meet him. And then Roach replied with a smile, why don't you wait until you meet him in the ring? You've been saying right along that you're going to beat him someday. Well, Tunney couldn't help himself, so hesitantly he walked over to where Dempsey was reading a newspaper and introduced himself. Dempsey shook Tunney's hand and said, nice to meet you. How are things going? Tunney replied, all right. except I'm having trouble with my right hand. I hurt the middle knuckle boxing in France more than a year ago, and it still hasn't healed. It's really funny that it's just to come out with that as well. It's brilliant. It's crazy, starstruck, clearly. Well, Dempsey actually took Tunney's hand and examined the knuckle, and then apparently advised him to put black tape on the good knuckles on both sides of the injured one before putting on his boxing gloves. So there's a little tip that he gave him. That way, Dempsey explained, when Tunney landed a punch with his right hand, the padding of the tape on the good knuckles would absorb the shock from the injured knuckle. But after shaking Dempsey's hand again and thanking him so profusely for his advice, he returned to Billy Roach and finally made it home to Greenwich Village. For all his success as a Marine boxer, Tunney did not find himself in demand by any fight managers or promoters when he returned home. He couldn't get his old job back either, and basically just never had a pot to piss in. But he did attract the attention of Sammy Kelly, a former featherweight boxer from Greenwich Village, who had become a boxing trainer and was interested in managing him.
He advanced him $100 to buy boxing gear and arranged for Tunney to train and spar at the City Athletic Club in Manhattan. From there it was agreed that he would be managed by his friend Billy Roach, who already knew how much of a talent Tunney was, so it made sense. In his first fight back since the war, Tunney outclassed Dan O'Dowd on December the 16th, 1919. During 1920, Tunney was matched against average fighters to build up his reputation and confidence. He knocked out 11 in a row. By October, all of them in New Jersey, where Tunney continued to fight since professional boxing was still outlawed in the state of New York. His most impressive victory during that stretch was an 8th-round knockout of another journeyman, Al Roberts, on February the 2nd in Newark. Shortly after the Roberts win, Roach and Tunney split, so he turned to Frank Doc Bagley, who had managed him before he went into the Marines. But in his next fight on October the 25th, Tunney re-injured his right hand again against another veteran journeyman named Paul Samson Corner, and was forced to go the 8-round distance in a no-decision bout that many felt Tunney clearly won. Rather than bow out of 2 commitments and rest the hand, Tunney fought twice more in 1920, both times against Leo Hook, an experienced New Jersey heavyweight, and clearly outpointed him both times in no-decision bouts, while fighting almost exclusively with his left hand. Now moving back to Dempsey, and while waiting to make the first defence of the world title, he was sucked into a world of motion pictures, starring in Daredevil Jack and vaudeville circus acts, where he earned more money than in the ring.
Following his defeat, Jess Willard publicly called Dempsey a fraud for not fighting in the Great War. The new champ swept his insults under the carpet, not concerned that his damaging words would affect him or his career. However, it was Maxine, his estranged wife or ex-wife, who came out of the shadows and actually wrote a letter to the editor of the San Francisco paper declaring that Dempsey a slacker and insisted that he had falsified his draft papers. Dempsey said in his own words, she, as in Maxine, insinuated that not only was I yellow-bellied coward, but that she had supported me as well as the rest of my family. She also wrote that she had in possession certain incriminating letters. The news broke in every newspaper, and it painted Dempsey as a slacker and a fake. His Daredevil Jack series was scrapped before finishing, and his credibility and image was scrutinized. But that wasn't the worst of it. On February the 27th, 1920, a federal grand jury ordered an indictment filed and issued a bench warrant with a fixed $1,000 bail. And this is what Dempsey said. He said that I was charged with unlawfully, willingly and knowingly evading and attempting to evade the draft on the grounds of dependency. Courtroom drama went on for 7 days, where his mother Celia Dempsey actually testified, without Dempsey we wouldn't have had anything. Therefore, Dempsey could not have been drafted into the war because his dad was actually riddled with arthritis and unable to work, and his brothers and sisters were also unable to work because of varying illnesses. After Dempsey testified on the last day, the case went to the jury on June 15, and after only 10 minutes of deliberations, the jury had reached the verdict for, obviously, not guilty.
The courtroom erupted with cheers. Dempsey told reporters, "I'm the happiest boy in the world. Now I can start square and not feel that people are thinking that I tried to get out of doing my duty." No matter, the case didn't completely clear his name, as some still considered him to be a slacker and a draft dodger. Apart from 2 exhibitions, Dempsey did not fight again until September the 6th, 1920 against Billy Misk in his first title defence. The fight was held at a minor league baseball stadium in the resort town of Benton Harbor, Michigan on Labor Day afternoon, September the 6th, 1920. Dempsey knocked him out in 3 rounds. In the meantime, Gene Tunney had noticed in the newspapers that Jack Dempsey was going to fight in Madison Square Garden for the first time on December 14th in his second title defence of the heavyweight crown. 8 months had passed since Tunney had enjoyed the chance meeting with Dempsey during that ferry trip from New Jersey. Now for the first time he would finally get a chance to see Dempsey in the ring and find out firsthand whether he was as ferocious a fighter as they were saying. Tunney wouldn't miss the fight against Bill Brennan for anything in the world. Brennan, who in 65 professional fights had only been knocked out once by Dempsey in the 6th round of their first fight in Milwaukee on February the 25th, 1918. In that fight, Dempsey was called a slacker and recalled feeling like he wanted to die, and for some years after that, "I wish he had died." Their rematch was to be Dempsey's first fight in New York since the summer of 1916, and he's still worried about the public reaction when he climbed into the ring against him once more. It was evident that the crowd were on Brennan's side from the off, as Dempsey was greeted with boos.
In a close fight, after 12 rounds, Dempsey landed a vicious right uppercut to Brennan's body, then his signature shot, a left hook to Brennan's right side, sent the challenger down on his hands and knees. Brennan struggled to his feet a split second after the referee counted him out. Ring announcer John Humphreys raised Dempsey's hand and announced that he had retained his world heavyweight title. The crowd cheered for Dempsey and Brennan's good effort, but the champion was honoured to have turned the crowd into his favour. As Tunney left the garden, unnoticed and unimpressed with the champ, he also witnessed openings that he could exploit that Brennan wasn't able to. The straight right hand was the shot he would use, and it would be with his right knuckles taped exactly as Dempsey had suggested at their chance meeting. Tunney had showed promise after his discharge from the Marines, but after breaking his left thumb in one of his last fights in 1920, and with his often injured right hand also hurting, Tunney decided to get away from boxing and from New York altogether. A friend recommended that he go to a lumber camp in Ontario where he could work as a logger, a physically demanding job, but one that would not put excessive pressure on his tender hands. So from late December until the end of March, Tunney spent 3 months at the lumber camp, starting at 5 a.m. each working day, cutting down trees, chopping up trunks and branches. After a while, his hands had sufficiently healed enough that he could begin sparring, and spent a month and a half in Poland Spring, Maine. Tunney put in 8 hours a day shoveling coal, and by the time he was able to eventually return to New York, he actually now weighed 185 pounds, 15 pounds more than he had when he left. Hard labour as a lumberjack and coal shoveling had not only given his brittle hands a rest, but Tunney had also bulked up into a heavyweight.
With his hands in relatively good shape, Tunney began training for 2 fights as soon as he returned that Doc Bagley had arranged for him. The first was against an average fighter named Young Ambrose in Manhattan, but the second was only 4 days later against Soldier Jones of Canada on the undercard of Jack Dempsey versus George Carpentier. Tunney was particularly looking forward to the second bout, aware that he would be fighting in front of a huge crowd, already being projected at more than 100,000 people. Accustomed to fighting in small arenas in front of several thousand spectators or less, Tunney was in awe when he came down the aisle of Boyle's 30 acres to enter the ring for his fight against Jones. By then, about an hour before the Dempsey-Carpentier bout was scheduled to start, around 60,000 spectators were already in their wooden seats of the stadium built by Tex Rickard in a New Jersey swamp across the Hudson River from Manhattan for a fight he billed as the fight of the century. Tunney was still not in good fighting shape, and he was more nervous of the massive crowd than he was of his opponent. Jones was awkward and made Tunney look poor for the first couple of rounds, but once Tunney settled down, he began to let his hands go, and the combinations followed. Eventually, he wore down the Canadian and prompted the referee to stop the fight in the 7th round. It wasn't a spectacular performance, and it certainly didn't prompt those watching to think that this man could derail Dempsey's heavyweight reign, but it was worthwhile. After his fight, Tunney put on a robe, then knelt in a corner at ringside to watch the main event. As it developed, he was to notice something that would in due time change his life forever.
So moving into the headliner, and Rickard had promoted the first $1 million gate in boxing history as actually promoted as Heroes versus Villain, or Hero versus Villain, with the hero in this case not being the American but the Frenchman. The reigning light heavyweight champion, Georges Carpentier, was a distinguished pilot in World War I, while Dempsey, as we have already mentioned, was cast as the villain for wrongly being accused of avoiding the military draft. Dempsey recorded that, "I climbed into the ring and disrobed to a chorus of cheers mingled with jeers and cries of 'Slacker, get out of here, you bum.' It was worse when they saw the American flag sewn on the waist of my white trunks. Several hostile ringsiders threatened to rip the trunks off of me. I tried to ignore them. I was in the ring to fight." And fight, well, he did. Dempsey floored Carpenter twice in the 4th round and left the Frenchman unconscious as he was counted out, laying on his side with his face on the mat. The finishing combination from Dempsey was a right to the ribs with a left to the shin, and after knocking out his opponent, he actually helped Carpenter's seconds carry their fighter back to the corner. Dempsey would not fight again though until the 4th of July 1923. Well, Gene Tunney finished the year with 6 more victories, all in New York, and the last 4 by knockouts, which he actually credited the tape that Dempsey showed him. That's why he was knocking these guys out now. 2 of them in Madison Square Garden. Perhaps Tunney's most memorable fight during that stretch was a one-sided bout in Staten Island. Having already knocked down his opponent Eddie Josephs 9 times, Tunney actually eased up in the 12th and final round, refusing to throw a punch because of his opponent's condition, which included several broken ribs and cuts around the face. He took the victory, but his lack of a killer instinct and an unimpressive performance against Soldier Jones on the Carpentier and Dempsey undercard led most New York boxing writers to wonder whether Tunney might not be something special after all.
Now, to Tunney's surprise, Dempsey was at ringside on October the 14th when he made his Madison Square Garden debut in a scheduled 8-round main event fight against Jack Burke. World champion Dempsey was even introduced before the fight, in which Tunney looked impressive, knocking out Burke in 3 rounds. However, he couldn't understand why his press coverage was still limited. Doc Bagley explained that he needed sports writers on his payroll if he wanted the press coverage, that performances alone wouldn't be enough. Tunney, who was still earning less than $1,000 per fight, was shocked, but agreed to let Bagley work out financial arrangements with several writers, reportedly including Damon Runyon and Bill Farnsworth, the sports editor of the New York American. Under the arrangement, Bagley told Tunney the writers would receive 5% of his future purses and that it would be a good idea if they handed out financial gifts to some other important sports writers, which could help him get more main event appearances in places like Madison Square Garden and more stories in the New York papers. After a short time, Tunney found out as soon as Bagley began paying off the writers that he began to get more space in some of the New York articles and in some other big city newspapers around the country. During this time, Tex Rickard decided to create his own title in the 175-pound division and call it the American Light Heavyweight Championship. He had two fighters in mind to compete for the new title, Gene Tunney and Battling Levinsky. It was a risky fight to make, as both were known as counterpunchers, but Rickard gambled on Tunney being the more aggressive because he was more eager to impress. The numbers weren't bad when the fight arrived, with the largest crowd ever to see a fight in the redeveloped Madison Square Garden. 14,000 attended predominantly for Tunney, who received a huge ovation when he entered the ring.
Well, the fight itself, it's a one-sided fight, with Tunney winning all 12 rounds on the scorecards of two judges. It was when they had two judges, and if they drew the same, then the referee would decide. But that was how it was. Well, later, Tunney actually revealed how Levinsky asked him at the start of the last round not to knock him out and to let him finish the fight on his feet. And Tunney, well, he naively agreed. And he recalled in his own words that, lo and behold, the battler lets me have it right on the jaw with a right-hand punch. I felt so foolish and actually laughed, realising that I had been had by a great old pro. But I declined to respond any kind and let him finish the fight. A gentleman, absolute gentleman, Tunney. I'm liking this guy more and more we're doing this. Tunney followed up the Levinsky win with 4 more victories, 3 by knockouts, which paved the way for Billy Gibson and Tex Rickard to set up his hardest defense of the American light heavyweight title against one of the all-time greats, the Pittsburgh Windmill, Harry Greb. However, Rickard would have more serious pressing matters to contend with when 7 underage girls alleged that he had sexually assaulted them. Rickard was actually detained in prison during the week-long trial, and we will one day go through the details in a Tex Rickard career profile. But in short, the sexual assaults apparently happened in the swimming pool and hotel rooms in Madison Square Garden. Rickard, of course, denied the allegations. There were several other contributing factors, but in an all-male jury, it took only an hour and a half to return a not guilty verdict. On March 27th, hearing the verdict, Rickard grabbed the railing in front of the fence table as his knees slumped and the courtroom erupted into cheers. Later, Rickard told reporters, "I shot craps for $30,000 a throw, but I never went through anything like this last hour." All we're going to say is there is no smoke without fire, and regardless of the verdict, Tex Rickard's reputation was tarnished.
While Rickard evaded prison and Tunney was training for his first fight with Greb, Jack Dempsey was, in his words, having a ball in Europe, travelling to England, France and Germany. With no challenges in sight and not having fought since knocking out George Carpenter in July of 1921, Dempsey had kept busy away from the ring, shooting a movie series in Hollywood and appearing in some touring vaudeville shows. Dempsey recalled, "We just had a good time. Lots of cafes, dancing, going to the racetrack, receptions and laughs. You should have seen it in 1922, especially if you could have been my age and the heavyweight champion of the world," hinting at the many female companions he met along the way. Damon Runyon, who had an assignment for the Hearst-owned King Features Syndicate, wrote that Dempsey prowled the ship like a big animal investigating a new cage. He went bounding about, nosying into every nook and corner. Each day, Dempsey ran about 5 miles on the ship's deck, worked out with weights, skipped rope and sparred a few rounds with Joe Benjamin, a lightweight boxer and close friend. Dempsey arrived back in New York on May the 19th, when he told reporters he was prepared to fight any available contenders, including Harry Wills, the coloured heavyweight champion. However, for as long as Rickard was Dempsey's promoter, there was no way Wills was going to get a shot at the heavyweight title. In the opinion of Rickard, and indeed most white people, America wasn't ready for another black champion, and neither was the half-blind Sam Langford. Dempsey did admit in later life, "They always said I wasn't afraid of any man. The hell I wasn't. I was afraid of Sam Langford because I knew he would flatten me."
Big Sam, half blind, still could knock out Dempsey. I love that. Tunney and Harry Greb, well, fought for the first time on May the 23rd, 1922 at Madison Square Garden and would fight another 4 times. Now, Tunney actually lost the first by a 15-round decision. After his one and only loss, Tunney was surprised when Abe Patel came into his dressing room and he told him, "Kid, you're the gamest fighter I ever saw. I lost $2,500 on you. The hell with it." Then he leaned over and kissed Tunney's face, which had been cut to pieces by Harry Greb, and said, "Doc, will you sell your contract with this kid to me? He certainly will be the next heavyweight champion in the world." Having been badly beaten up by Harry Greb in May, Tunney fought to a no decision against Tommy Lothram 3 months later. But some misleading sports writers, predominantly those from Philadelphia where the fight was held, believed Lothram deserved the victory. Needing to prove himself, Tunney fought 3 more times in 1922, winning 1 fight by decision and the last 2 by knockout. Tunney then bought out the contract of his manager at the time, Doc Bagley, for $5,000, feeling that he was partially to blame for the beating he absorbed from Greb and his poor performance against Lothram. He then hired Billy Gibson, who had guided Benny Leonard to the lightweight title, as his new manager. Tunney said sometime later that Billy was very smart and resourceful about the business of managing boxers, though he never thoroughly understood boxing technique. He signed a 3-year contract and guaranteed Gibson a third of the future earnings. After his first 2 fights under Gibson in early 1923, Tunney prepared for his rematch with Harry Greb on February 23rd at Madison Square Garden with the assistance of Benny Leonard. Gibson actually brought in Leonard for advice and also for occasional sparring, and it was that advice to target the body that Benny Leonard gave Gene Tunney that was imperative, as Tunney went on to take a split decision victory and avenge his sole defeat and regain that American light heavyweight title.
It was somewhat controversial. Please do go back and check out Harry Greb's career profile for more information. Tunney's next move was to capture the world light heavyweight title against the champion Georges Carpentier, but the Frenchman wasn't interested in risking his title, so the fight never materialised. Instead, Tunney decided it was time to fight some heavyweights in preparation for Jack Dempsey, who had enjoyed his 2-year break from the ring, gallivanting around Europe and appearing in vaudeville shows. But it was now time for another defence. Part of the reason for his long gap between defences was down to the chairman of the New York State Athletic Commission, William Muldoon, who refused to sanction heavyweight title fights in the state because of greedy managers and promoters. But some believe it was more to do with the racist old white men who didn't want to allow Harry Wills to get a shot at the world title, fearing that he would beat Dempsey. Then out of the blue, Kearns was made an offer from a retired publisher, James Boddy Johnson, and a colleague, Mel McCutcheon, of $200,000 for Dempsey to fight on July the 4th in Shelby, Montana, and of course he accepted. The consortium didn't have enough money, never had a venue, and hadn't even agreed on an opponent for Dempsey to fight. It was a real gamble for a town with a population of just under 1,000 since 1923. We will go through all the details of how this fight destroyed this small town, thanks to the money-grabbing Doc Kearns, but for now, we will keep it short and sweet. Kearns actually managed to squeeze out another $100,000 from the consortium by using his manipulation skills, which included alcohol and ladies of the night, raising the total earnings to $300,000. Tommy Gibbons was chosen as Dempsey's challenger, and although not keen, Kearns twisted his arm. After the fight had been cancelled on a few occasions due to late payments, it was finally given the green light on the 13th hour.
Yeah, I mean, we will be hopefully we'll be getting a Jack Dempsey career profile, so we'll go through some of this. There's loads of information on this fight, but Dempsey did actually arrive as a hero. However, the locals began to dislike the champion due to what they read in the newspapers of him earning more money than anyone could have earned in their entire lifetime. His public appeal was quickly diminishing, while the family man Gibbons, who earned nothing for the fight, was actually fighting just for the title, was becoming a fan favourite. The attendance was absolute disaster, with about only 12,000 people attending in a 40,000 seat outdoor arena. Just moments before the fight, Dempsey was actually overwhelmed by an angry mob baying for his blood. Dempsey recalled in later years, for the first time and only time, I was more worried about getting hurt by the crowd than by the guy I was fighting. The fight took place in midday at 95-degree heat and was a 15-round one-sided victory for Dempsey, but he did look lackluster and obviously rusty in his performance, considering all that great adventure to Europe he had. The crowd booed the champion, who pretty much legged it out of Shelby with his manager, shit scared, and bodyguards, while Gibbons was cheered. The challenger actually left the stadium in his ring attire and walked a quarter of a mile to a nearby cottage where he actually stayed with his wife and 3 children, and was followed all the way home by hundreds of cheering supporters yelling, "Tell me, tell me." Dempsey may have defended his title. Well, he earned big money. His reputation took a battering. Gate receipts actually totaled approximately $80,000, of which the Inland Revenue reportedly took 10% of, leaving Kearns and Dempsey with about $72,000, bringing their total purse of $272,000 split down the middle. Kearns probably took about 60. Unfortunately for Shelby, Montana, the event almost bankrupted the town, and the gamble to put the small town on the map never happened. Kearns was not remorseful in any way, and in his autobiography, The $1 Million Gate, he said the financial raid was satisfactory revenge on the state of Montana for this early fleecing of my father. Apparently, they took him for $100,000 back in the day. I got it back some 45 years later with 200% compound interest.
Next up was the Argentine heavyweight Luis Angel Firpo, who had knocked out former heavyweight champion Jess Willard, which was promoted by Tex Rickard, now back in boxing after the molestation allegations. He agreed with Doc Kearns to get a fight made with Dempsey, who with Kearns earned slightly more than $500,000, the equivalent today of more than $5 million. While Firpo ended up with almost $200,000, the equivalent of about $2 million today. The fight took place at the Polo Grounds in New York on September the 14th, 1923, and the gate surpassed $1 million the day before the fight. That made it the second fight to earn more than $1 million, and both involved Dempsey. A total of just over 86,000 tickets were sold, and some estimated that 35,000 spectators were turned away. The opening round will go down as one of the greatest ever in the history of the sport, with Firpo hitting the deck 7 times. Then late in the round, Firpo sent Dempsey through the ropes with a powerful right hand. Dempsey barely got back through the ropes and survived the round. After a total of 10 knockdowns, Dempsey finally stopped the bigger and heavier challenger in the second round. Dempsey was grilled by the press for his performance and the amount of money he was making. Many felt that the $500,000 was just too much. Not even the President of the United States was making that sort of dough. Nat Fleischer felt that Firpo should have been declared the winner because of Dempsey's illegal blows and refusal to go to a neutral corner and assistance from reporters getting back into the ring. Although the press was unhappy with Dempsey's tactics, most sports fans saw him as the biggest sports hero in the United States and perhaps the world. However, because of the controversies in the fight, new rules were specified.
The first was that a fighter had to return to the ring within 10 seconds under his own power rather than being helped by the press. And the other was more important, that a referee was not to begin a count until a fighter had gone to the furthest neutral corner. Now, after the fight, Dempsey and Kearns' relationship fell apart due to financial and personal issues. Although in his prime at 28, Dempsey would not defend his title again for 3 years, but would remain in the public eye while earning over $2 million, most of it from appearing on movies. Dempsey fought only a few profitable exhibition fights, went back to the profitable vaudeville circuit, and remarried an actor, Estelle Taylor, in February of 1925. Now, while the champ took a long break from the ring, Tunney continued with his career and his target of someday getting an opportunity against Dempsey. Since he and Greb were 1 win each, Tex Rickard knew that a rubber match would be a big attraction. He did not have to work hard to convince Tunney and Greb and their managers that the third fight would be lucrative for everyone involved and everyone concerned. So the bout was set for December the 10th, 1923. Once again, Madison Square Garden was the venue. Tunney took a unanimous decision, with most sports writers feeling the result was correct. However, the crowd disapproved. As mentioned earlier, Tunney and Greb would fight twice more in Cleveland on September the 17th, 1924, and in St. Paul, Minnesota on March the 27th, 1925. By now, Tunney had grown into a fully fledged heavyweight, which gave him the advantage over the much smaller Harry Greb. Therefore, if the second, third and fourth fights were considered close by many, the outcome in St. Paul was conclusive. Tunney won easily, before a capacity crowd of around 9,000, with Greb again being outweighed considerably, that time by 14 pounds.
As we mentioned in Greb's career profile, the records indicate Tunney won 3 of the fights and lost 1, with 1 ending in a draw. Between his third and fourth fights with Greb, Tunney won 7 straight. His most significant victory came on July 24, 1924, over George Carpentier, who was making his second appearance in the United States since being knocked out by Jack Dempsey in 1921. A crowd of around 40,000 turned out for the fight at the Polo Grounds, and Pierce Egan, the 18th century British boxing historian, described their meeting as the sweet science of Fistiana. Carpentier won only 1 of the first 9 rounds and was on the verge of being knocked out in the 10th when Tunney put him down twice with left hooks to the jaw. Tunney put the Frenchman down in the 14th with a body shot, but he moaned foul, got back to his feet and was carried back to his corner. Still holding his bollocks and off balance, Carpentier moved toward the centre of the ring to begin the round, but then sagged to the canvas as Tunney backed off in confusion, while Decamps continued to scream, "Foul!" After about 30 seconds of utter chaos, the referee finally waved Tunney to his corner, and ring announcer Joe Humphreys climbed into the ring and raised Tunney's right hand, signifying that the fight was over. After the last Greb fight, Tunney announced that he would only fight heavyweights, with the intention of convincing Tex Rickard that he had the best chance of beating Jack Dempsey. Harry Wills was once again overlooked due to the colour of his skin, so Rickard set up the next tough opponent for Tunney, while Dempsey was contemplating his return to the ring against Tommy Gibbons, who had gone the distance with Dempsey and Shelby and never been knocked down, let alone knocked out in over 60 fights.
Well, Tunney was eager to showcase himself, and Rickard was confident that the fight would be a big draw, so decided to stage it at the Polo Grounds on June 5th, 1925. A crowd of about 40,000 attended the fight, along with many women who had taken an interest in the good-looking Tunney. Gibbons was a clever fighter, and Tunney, who was ahead of his time when studying his opponents, and over the last couple of years had learned a way of how to beat Gibbons. The fight was one-sided, with Tunney winning every round but one before he put Gibbons down for the first time in his career with a right uppercut to the body, followed by a right to the chin in the 12th round. Though badly hurt, Gibbons got back to his feet. Tunney, once again, he does this. He hesitated and gave him a time to raise his gloves to defend himself. Tunney actually later said that, "I hate to hit in a situation like this, but the game calls for a finish. So I just put just enough power into the right hand, clip to the jaw to sink Tom once again on his haunches." This time, Gibbons was counted out. His victory was highly praised in the press, and James Dawson of the New York Times actually wrote that Tunney's victory is expected to pave the way for the heavyweight championship bout between the Greenwich Village boxer and Jack Dempsey. Tunney said after the fight that, "I think I have established my right to the championship match with Jack Dempsey tonight. Now I want Dempsey." Tunney went on to close out 1925 with victories over 4 more heavyweights, but the highlight of the year was actually a sparring session with his dad's favourite boxer of all time, and that was the then 59-year-old James J. Corbett. And Tunney was in absolute awe of Corbett's boxing skills, and he purred that, "I honestly think he's better than Benny Leonard. It was the greatest thing I've ever seen."
So now we are going to move in to the build-up for Jack Dempsey versus Gene Tunney. Well, Dempsey was now ready for a return to the ring after living in the Hollywood lifestyle. He convinced his wife, Estelle, it was time to defend his title. Thinking he no longer had a manager, Estelle noticed that Jack had signed a 3-year agreement in 1923 with Kearns that did not end until August the 9th, 1926. Estelle told her husband, "Whatever you do, don't agree to fight until after the agreement ends. Otherwise, Kearns will say he deserves half of what you make." Dempsey informed Tex Rickard of his decision to return to the ring to defend his title, and the promoter automatically thought Tunney would be the most logical challenger. He wanted the fight to be held in New York, either at the Yankee Stadium or the Polo Grounds, but the New York State Athletic Commission initially ruled against it. They wanted Dempsey-Wills. Then after a revote, they agreed for Tunney to be his next defence. It all seemed to be working out, until the State Licence Committee, a separate body from the Athletic Commission, denied a boxing licence to Dempsey unless he would agree to fight Wills first. It was a matter of either moving the fight outside of New York or take the fight with Wills, but Dempsey wasn't interested, so he urged Rickard to promote a Tunney-Wills elimination fight. But in an interesting development, Wills' manager, Paddy Mullins, rejected a $250,000 offer to fight Tunney, with the winner to meet Dempsey for the World Heavyweight title, on the grounds that Wills, as the top-ranked contender, was entitled to fight Dempsey without having to beat Tunney. While negotiations over who fights who were being ironed out, the commission accepted Gene Tunney, a long-time acquaintance and no experience in boxing, as Dempsey's new manager. When a New York State Attorney General, Albert Ottinger, ruled that Dempsey was entitled to a license despite the License Committee ruling, the committee stood firm, ignoring Ottinger's legal opinion and refusing to grant Dempsey a license.
Well, an appeal was never made, so the fight was actually forced to be relocated elsewhere. Now, with the fight signed, it was signed as never had a venue, but a location yet to be confirmed. Tunney went to California. In the meantime, why not? To film a series entitled The Fighting Marine. He actually spent 9 weeks in Hollywood doing the series, his only venture into movie making at the time. Now, while shooting, Tunney actually lived at the Hollywood Athletic Club, so he could continue to work out daily to keep himself in shape for his up-and-coming world title fight. On his return, a location for the fight was actually finally made. It was a lucrative offer from the officials at the Sesquicentennial exhibition in Philadelphia. Tunney would have preferred the fight or the world title fight to be in his hometown city, so he would have been slightly disappointed. But obviously, he's got the world title fight. He's happy. But Dempsey was furious at the license committee. He vowed that he would never again fight in New York. As far as New York is concerned, I am through, he said. The Dempsey-Tunney fight was announced on August the 18th, but the bout would be held at the Sesquicentennial Stadium in 5 weeks' time, on September the 23rd, 1926. Many, including Nat Fleischer and some of the highly respected sports writers, wondered why Dempsey wasn't fighting Harry Wills. Rickard wasn't bothered, and he had already thought out an angle. He wanted to promote this fight. It would be the handsome, clean-cut former Marine from New York whose boxing skills imitated James J. Corbett against a roughneck with a deadly punch who had been labelled a slacker for accepting a deferment during the Great War. In the book, Tunney, boxing's brainiest champ, and his upset of the great Jack Dempsey, written by Jack Kavanagh, he actually described what Rickard would have said to both fighters. And he said that Rickard told Tunney that Dempsey was not only out of shape, but after 3 years of inactivity in the ring would be easy pickings. Then he told the champion that Tunney was a good light heavyweight, but couldn't possibly hurt him and would be lucky to get past the second round. It was the quintessential Rickard con, and both fighters, well, they knew it.
It was a plotline that the sports writers ate up with vigour, and the differences of the two fighters made it even more intriguing. Dempsey was from the west, Tunney from the east. Dempsey was the slugger who fought out of a crouch, whereas Tunney was the stand-up boxer. Dempsey the knockout artist against Tunney, the skillful boxer who regarded boxing as more of a chess match. Dempsey would savagely beat up his sparring partners and be a killer in the ring, But Tunney was methodical in his approach and was not interested in hurting the other guy. He once said, "I found no joy in knocking people unconscious. The lust for battle and massacre was missing." There were a few more significant differences that favoured the underdog Tunney, who had not just watched Dempsey fight in person 3 times, but he had studied the film footage of many more of his fights. One thing that he was convinced he had spotted was Dempsey's vulnerability to a straight right-hand punch. In both the Carpentier and Firpo fights, he had been jarred and even knocked down by Firpo by right-hand blows to the jaw. With Tunney finding a technical vulnerability, he was also the more active fighter, fighting 19 times in 3 years against some of the best in the business, like Johnny Risco, Harry Greb, Tommy Gibbons and George Carpentier, while Dempsey, now 31, lived a lavish lifestyle in Los Angeles for 3 years and pulled punches in vaudeville acts. The champ would be rusty, have a readable aggressive style, knew little about his challenger, but was still the favourite. Dempsey had, according to most record books, only 4 more fights, 81 to Tunney's 77, but most likely far more than that were recorded. Tunney, who was 2 years younger at 29, had boxed more rounds, 513 to 320. Dempsey had knocked out most of his opponents early, including 25 in the first round, while scoring 50 knockouts overall. That was only 6 more knockouts than Tunney, who was considered a boxer and not a knockout artist.
Yet as the fight approached, everyone backed Dempsey by a knockout against the unproven light heavyweight with brittle hands. The only ex-fighter to go against the grain was Harry Greb, who had fought Tunney 5 times and sparred successfully with Jack Dempsey. And he said, "You can set me down as a loony when I tell you I've put $2,000 on Tunney to win. I know that Tunney can do through personal experience, and I've got a line on Dempsey. When I boxed him, I had no trouble hitting him, for he hasn't got the speed stuff now that made him so dangerous. He can't break through Tunney's guard, and Tunney is a far harder puncher than people give him credit for." The former featherweight champion Abe Patel, who was another who agreed with Greb, said that Tunney showed me enough to convince me I'll place $4,000 on Gene to win. Kenny Leonard actually picked Dempsey to win, but he had planned secretly to bet on the underdog, as in Gene Tunney, and he said this of Dempsey. He said he's a marvel at taking punishment, and I don't think there's a man alive who can survive in a ring after Dempsey crushes a fearful left hook to the chin or a right to the body. Most of the big name journalists, including Bratland Rice, Onions, Ring Lardner, Paul Gallico, the Westbrook Pegler, picked Dempsey for knockout of Tunney all day long. Although Greb was confident of a Tunney victory, the man he bet on wasn't as confident as he seemed. Now, Tunney actually admitted in later years that he was battling a mental issue with how the fight was going to play out. And we're both going to run through this, Sean. So I'll start what Tunney says. He says, "One night at the beginning of my long training period, I awakened suddenly and felt my head shaking. It seemed fantastic. Ghosts or what? Then I understood it was I who was shaking, trembling so hard that I made the bed tremble. I was that much afraid of what Jack Dempsey would do to me."
Tunney continued to say, "The fear was lurking in the back of my mind and had set me quaking in my sleep. The nightmare thought of myself being beaten down by Dempsey's shattering punches. The vision was of myself, bleeding, mauled and helpless, sinking to the canvas and being counted out. I couldn't stop trembling. Right there, I had already lost that ring match, which meant everything to me. The championship, I had lost it, unless I could regain it. I had been thinking about the fight in the wrong way. I had been reading the newspapers, and all they had said was how Tunney would lose. Through the newspapers, I was losing the battle in my own mind. When the nightmares persisted, despite my inner conviction that I knew how to beat Dempsey, I decided to stop reading the sports pages, and I did, until after the fight. I simply had to close the doors of my mind to destructive thoughts and divert my attention to other things. Well, this just demonstrates how important it is to have the correct mentality. You can be physically and technically ready, but if you're mentally beaten before a fight, it's very difficult to impose your other attributes. Now, Dempsey prepared in Los Angeles, New York, and in Saratoga Springs, while in Stillman's gym, in front of a crowd of several hundred, Dempsey was as furious as ever. He knocked out 2 sparring partners inside of 2 minutes, both with left hooks, and fought 3 full rounds. 1 round with one fighter and 2 rounds with another before climbing a stairway to the 3rd floor to skip rope and unleash uppercuts into the heavy bag. Tunney trained in the tiny upstate New York hamlet of Speculator and was more lenient on his sparring partners.
And in his spare time, he actually relaxed reading books to empower his mind. And Tunney explained, by doing so, I forgot all about the forthcoming fight, even when reading on the actual day of the fight. Under the terms of the contract, Dempsey got $700,000, the equivalent of about 7.5 million in today's money, and Tunney $200,000, slightly over $2 million in today's money. For both fighters, it would be by far their largest purses to date, but how much Dempsey would finally take home was in question due to the financial suits made against him by none other than his former manager, Doc Kearns. He was actually seeking 1/3 of his earnings for the Dempsey-Wills fight, believe it or not. That actually never happened. And 1/3 of the Tunney fight, which hadn't even happened yet, because the fight contract was actually signed before the contract with Dempsey ran out. Well, at the time, B.C. Clements, the head of the Chicago Coliseum Club in Illinois, who had taken over from a guy called Floyd Fitzsimmons, the original promoter of that projected Dempsey-Wills fight, was also suing Dempsey for a breach of contract. Now, the stories about Kearns's and Clements' legal maneuvers were, of course, front page news in Philadelphia, New York, and Atlantic City, which would have made it very difficult for Dempsey to actually focus his mind on the job at hand. Fortunately, the Clements case was actually thrown out of court a couple of days before the fight, but Dempsey was distraught with Kearns, and who he still considered to be a dear friend, no matter what their differences was in recent years. He just couldn't believe he was being such an arsehole. Now, during an interview with an old friend, Ed Van Every of the New York Evening World, had a chat with Tunney, and Tunney was very confident. He said, "Think this over very carefully. What has Dempsey done since he fought Bill Brennan back in 1920? It took him 12 rounds to bring Bill down, and then he had to resort to fouls. If Jack could not bring Bill down inside 10 rounds, how does he figure to fare any better against me in 10? Because that was the scheduled rounds, 10 rounds.
Tunney then went on to say, "I think I can say without boasting that I'm a better boxer than Dempsey, who must have been close to his best 6 years ago, and yet could do nothing with Brennan in 10 rounds. That is one of my reasons for feeling that it is in the cards for me to win." The day before the fight, Tunney played a round of golf and told reporters, "I am confident that I will win. I do not despise the abilities of my opponent, but I have unlimited confidence of my own, and tomorrow night's fight will show that I was justified in it." Dempsey, while relaxing to some jazz and playing checkers, told reporters, "I'm going in there to make it a short fight. I'll be tearing after Tunney from the sound of the first gong, and I'll be trying to knock out Tunney with the first punch if I can, because I know he will be trying to do the same to me. One thing is certain, I'm in excellent condition and ready for the battle of my life." The night before the fight, both Dempsey and Tunney went to bed early, around 10 o'clock. Dempsey had dined with Dre Normile and Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, who he had now hired as his chief second a few days earlier, while Tunney had dinner at the Glenbrook Club with his brother Tom, his close friend Bernard Gimble, Jimmy Bronson, and actor and longtime friend Bill Russell. On the day of the fight, railroad officials said about 60,000 riders had boarded regularly scheduled and chartered trains at New York's Pennsylvania station, while another 15,000 departed on trains leaving from Jersey City. Anyone who was anyone made the trip to Philadelphia for the Dempsey-Tunney fight. Hollywood stars like Charlie Chaplin is one we will all know very well.
Many others which I'm sure we don't all know, but others included the most famous of all, the mobster in Al Capone, and even Arnold Rothstein, the New York racketeer who had engineered the fixing of the 1990 World Series. Elmer Davis actually wrote in the New York Times that the fight describing the crowd as the most opulent and most distinguished that ever saw a fight, which included an estimated 2,000 millionaires. In fact, almost everybody who professes to be a person of prominence and who was able to get down to Philadelphia at this particular time was on the premises. Another interesting stat was made in the Philadelphia Bulletin, who actually estimated that at least 10,000 of those in the crowd of 135 were actually women, predominantly there to see none other than Gene Tunney, no doubt. The fight had actually transcended the sport into a new domain. It was not just a boxing bout. It was an event that everyone wanted to see and be a part of. Tex Rickard had promoted the fight like a dream and demonstrated why he was the best promoter around during this time. Before leaving Philadelphia, Tunney spoke briefly to a small group around the third tee of the golf course where he played his golf before to relax. Then he declared that he would be travelling by plane. And this is what he said. He said, "I had to keep it a secret. Billy Gibson would have had a recurrence of his hay fever if he knew I was going to fly, and Rickard would have been down here with handcuffs. But, you know, it's really the sensible thing to do. First, I'll have a little diversion, which will keep my mind off of the fight. And second, it will be much quicker than the train or the motor car, and there won't be that contentious bumpy motion," he reckoned. Is very hard on the nerves. Well, little did Tunney know and realise that flight would be much worse than a car or a train.
The flight should have taken less than an hour, but due to the mist, it took an hour and a half and was bumpy as hell. Tunney was sick twice and exited the plane as white as a sheep. Straight after, he weighed in at 189.5 pounds. Dempsey was also sick on the day of the fight due to food poisoning, and he blamed the olive oil and weighed in at 190 pounds. Tunney tried to take a nap before the fight, but he was interrupted by his manager Billy Gibson, Max Boo Boo Hoff, and a man who turned out to be Hoff's lawyer. They asked him to sign 2 contracts. One was related to an agreement that Gibson had entered with Hoff. After reading it, and being anxious for Gibson, Hoff and the lawyer to leave, Tunney agreed to sign it. Hoff's lawyer then pulled out the other contract from his briefcase and handed it to Gibson, who then said to Tunney, "This one too," while asking him to sign it. Glancing at this document, Tunney saw that it was a long-term contract between Gibson and Tunney. Irate at Gibson for trying to deceive him only a few hours before the biggest fight of his life, Tunney threw the contract at them and demanded that they piss off. Tunney wrote that Hoff and his lawyer were trying to assure themselves of something in case I lost by a knockout. They had undoubtedly bet that way. Author Jack Kavanagh wrote, "Some people close to Gibson said that he had become concerned on the afternoon of the fight that the bout might be stolen from Tunney and offered Hoff a share of Tunney's purse so that he could exert whatever influence he had to protect Tunney's and of course his own interests."
Well, supposedly in the event Tunney was knocked down during the fight, Hoff was prepared to have a ringside doctor jump into the ring to award the fight to Tunney on a foul. Thus, Gibson's 11th hour concern may have been the reason he interrupted Tunney's pre-fight nap to let him know about that protection they had been guaranteed by Hoff and his lawyer. Whether Tunney ever signed a document agreeing to such an agreement never was determined, but the protection issue would linger and to a degree embarrassed Tunney way beyond the fight in Philadelphia. Whether it was there or not, it's almost irrelevant because it didn't happen. But it's very interesting how these guys are looking for a way out and put a fix in. Well, by 9 p.m, an hour before the fight, all 70,000 permanent seats were filled, along with most of those in the temporary seats and on the stadium grass and running track that surrounded the playing field. Half an hour before the fight, referee Tom Riley spoke to Tunney in the dressing room and informed him that there would be no rabbit punches and no kidney punches. He told him, "This fight is going to be honest, and I don't want any complaints or alibis from the loser." Tunney, becoming increasingly annoyed by the tone of Riley's question, said, "What do you mean?" Riley responded, "I'm telling you, I'm there to have an honest fight, and you both will be treated as though you are strangers to me." Well, Tunney jokingly said, "Well, you are a stranger to me. And what is more, you go and tell Mr. Dempsey just what you told me. Because if anyone's going to be a dirty fight, it's going to be Dempsey. Riley should have spoken to Dempsey. We don't ever know. We've never got it confirmed. I'm guessing he did. Rain was actually due just as the fight was about to start, and Dempsey told Rickard, don't worry about the rain. This guy ain't going to go over 2 rounds anyway. Tunney entered the ring first with a robe that showed the Marine Corps emblem. And the crowd, well, they went wild.
Dempsey kept Tunney waiting for 4 minutes before he made his way to the ring, and by now it was raining hard. Dempsey remembered. Many satin gowns, pumps and hairdos were ruined by the mud. I marched down the aisle towards the bright ring, accompanied by my handlers, trainers Gus Wilson and Jerry the Greek. All I heard was the sound of rain drowning out the clicking of the typewriters and the roar of the crowd. Lights aimed in my face, and I sweated, knowing damn well that I didn't have my former fighting spark. I knew that Doc was somewhere out there, among the many faces. The ropes and the canvas were soaked. The rain had made the air dull and heavy. As Dempsey entered the ring and headed for his corner, Tunney got up from his stool, walked toward Dempsey and said, "Hello, champion." Dempsey replied, "Hello, Gene." When the champion was introduced, there were cheers, along with many boos. After receiving their pre-fight instructions from referee Tommy Riley, Tunney said to Dempsey, "May the better man win, Jack." Dempsey mumbled something along the lines of, yeah. So now, we are going to move in to this historic fight, and beginning with round number 1. And as expected, and predicted by Jack himself, he went right after Tunney, who also, as expected, retreated. As Tunney would later say, he hoped that by backing up, he would make Dempsey believe that he was afraid of him, and said I wanted him to become a little overconfident. There were many clinches early in the round, as Dempsey stalked and missed, while Tunney continued to retreat. Then Tunney planted his feet firmly on the wet canvas and feinted twice with his left hand. Then as Dempsey dropped his left slightly before throwing a left hook, something Tunney had spotted by closely watching films of Dempsey's fights, he threw the punch he had worked on secretly for months, a quick right-hand lead which caught Dempsey on the left cheekbone. The punch buckled Dempsey's knees, and Tunney knew from the look on Dempsey's face that the punch had both hurt and shaken him.
Well, Tunney actually said sometime later that he was stopped in his tracks and his knees sagged. Perhaps if the punch landed on Jack's jaw, I may have knocked him out. However, Dempsey kept stalking Tunney, throwing right-hand leads and his trusted left hook, but few of the blows got through as he danced away in a clockwise fashion to avoid the dangerous left. By midway through the first round, Tunney was fighting with confidence and exchanging punches with Dempsey at close range, to the amazement of the sports writers at ringside and many others in the enormous crowd who felt that Tunney was playing with fire. Anyone in the past who dared mix it with Dempsey at close range had been knocked out. The difference was that Tunney's combinations of lefts and rights were landing and Dempsey's were not. By the time the bell sounded, the round had been one-sided in Tunney's favour, and Dempsey later admitted that from the time the bout started, I was aware that my body and brain weren't communicating properly. I was heavy-footed and sluggish and felt old, with legs that seemed shot. Was this the penalty I had to pay for my layoff, or was it something else? Well, everyone was in shock at just how bad the champion looked. The opening round set the tone as Tunney became more confident and continued to dance rings around Dempsey, usually moving to the left, as we've said, so Dempsey could not land that powerful left, but also becoming more aggressive by taking the fight to Dempsey.
Now moving into the third and fourth rounds, following that third round in which Tunney confidently outboxed Dempsey, Graham McNamee told his vast radio audience, "We will have to tell you that Tunney has now won 3 rounds. That was stunning news to most listeners, since the consensus was that Dempsey was likely to dominate the early rounds and probably knock out Tunney during the first 5 rounds. McNamee went on, "He is outboxing the champion from start to finish. Dempsey is absolutely unable to get going. He seems to have nothing except that now and then he shoots over a left." Dempsey did keep going, looking for an opening that Tunney refused to gift him, and it would only get worse for the champion. McNamee said halfway through the 4th round, "Dempsey seems to be satisfied to take all the punches. anything to get in on Tunney while standing flat-footed in the middle of the ring. Later in the round, McNamee added, "It is a very tame round, and once again Tunney shows his superiority." Tunney has now won 4 rounds in succession, but others thought that the 4th was Dempsey's best round, with several writers at ringside thinking that he'd won. In the round, Dempsey landed 3 good left hooks, the most damaging and hurtful of which was one to Tunney's neck. Tunney was to say after the fight, "Nobody gets to Jack's body as a rule and stays on his feet, but I tried, and in the wink of an eye Dempsey uncorked his left hook. It missed the button, but landed on my larynx. It all but paralysed my throat, and I was hoarse for a week afterward from the effects of that mighty wallop."
Went into rounds 5 and 8, and the rain, which had began before the opening, ran as a drizzle, or as Dempsey said, it quite hard, must have been on and off, continued to intensify, and by round 5 the canvas floor in the ring was soaking wet and slippery. Now Tunney, though, did not seem to slow down by the wet and slippery canvas, and neither did Jack Dempsey, to his credit, who was really struggling. While head down and in a crouch, he was met by a barrage of fast combinations of lefts and rights to either the head or the body. During the 5th, Dempsey landed low, and Tunney revealed after the fight, he said, "Keep 'em up, Jack," to which Tunney said Dempsey replied, "Sorry, Gene." Dempsey's clumsy showing against the fast-moving Tunney, even though it was wet as well, who kept landing with a devastating array of punches, was turning Dempsey's face into a mess, and the pattern continued as the fight wore on. Dempsey continued to stalk Tunney, but rarely landed a punch. He kept getting countered regularly with quick combinations, sharp left hooks, uppercuts, right crosses, almost of which connected. By the 8th round, Dempsey could barely see out of his blackened and cut right eye. Making matters worse, a chopping right by Tunney opened a cut along the left eye. By then, blood was flowing freely from Dempsey's mouth. By the end of the round, the result seemed to be a foregone conclusion. Dempsey's only chance was to knock Tunney out. At the end of round 8, McNamee told his audience, "Jack is showing no defense. The only thing he has been showing in an ungodly number of jolts to the jaw without worrying about him." So he's just taking punches without even thinking about it. Dempsey had now slowed down and seemed to have little left, but Tunney was still very cautious. Rather than hold and see out the fight, he continued to counter Dempsey's wild assaults with an assortment of punches of his own to the head and the body, ending the 8th with a left-right combination to the face and 2 lefts to the head. Dempsey's in world of trouble.
Now, the rain became a pour down by the 9th round, and Dempsey's strategy over the final 2 rounds was to crowd Tunney, as he had tried to do throughout the fight, and unload left hooks and right crosses. Most of those blows, however, were wild, and Tunney had little trouble eluding them. By the time Dempsey came out for the last round, there were cuts around both of his eyes. His left eye was closed, his face bruised and swollen, and blood flowed from his mouth. By contrast, Tunney, apart from a slight cut along his right eye, was virtually unmarked. Before the final bell sounded, Major White told his and McNamee's radio audience, including several thousand Tunney supporters in smoke-filled Madison Square Garden, "There is a new world champion in the making, and that Dempsey is a hollow shell of what he was." Dempsey could not impose himself on Tunney at any point in the fight, and due to Tunney's boxing brilliance, he was able to outclass one of the most ferocious heavyweights in the history of the sport. Before Joe Griffo announced the decision of the 2 judges, referee Tommy Riley's scorecard would only come into play if the judges disagreed on the winner. Thousands of drenched spectators had already headed towards the exits. They did not have to hear Griffo tell them that Tunney had won. Not only had Tunney become the first New Yorker to win the World Heavyweight Championship and the first heavyweight to do so by a decision, but he had won all 10 rounds on the scorecards of both judges. After Griffo's announcement, Dempsey, a bloody, puffy mess, walked over to Tunney's corner, put both arms around the new heavyweight champion and congratulated him and said, "Good boy, Gene, you were too good for me." And Tunney responded, "Thanks, Jack. You've been a great champion."
Well, as Dempsey left the ring, he actually remembered that the people were cheering me, clapping for me, calling out my name in a way I'd never heard before. I never realized how much I had hungered for a sound like that. And now here it was, on the night I blew my title. Tunney told reporters that, in his opinion, the fight was essentially over from the moment he rocked Dempsey with a straight right hand punch in the first round. He said that blow won the fight. Dempsey was dazed for the rest of the battle, and I was certain to outpoint him for the championship. Jack was battered and worn out at the end, and I may have knocked him out if the bout went a few more rounds. He then went on to heap praise on the former champion. He said he had the kick of a mule in his fist and the heart of a lion in his breast. I never fought a harder soccer, nor do I hope to meet one. Dempsey fought like a gentleman and never took an unfair advantage in the ring. Once or twice he may have hit me a little low, but always it was an accident. He never meant it. 2 doctors actually attended to Dempsey, who actually needed 6 stitches to close the wound over his left eye and treated his blackened and cut right eye and bloodied lip. Quiet and appearing distraught, Dempsey was eventually driven to his hotel room, still in his boxing trunks and silent. And Dempsey actually recalled that it took a while for it to sink in that I had lost my title. Although I had been cheered on leaving the ring, the 48 hours following the Tunney fight were tough. Everyone was talking about me and Tunney. But once the press and the doctor who had changed my bandages had gone, no one but Estelle and Jerry the Greek came to see me. I felt like a forgotten man, an instant has-been.
And that's quite common, isn't it, in boxing? They always say about look at the people that are in your dressing room once you lose, as opposed to those that are in there when you're a champion. It's still today a saying that is so true. Now, when he met with his wife at the hotel, she asked, "What happened, Ginsberg?" using her pet name for her husband. Dempsey's answer, when it appeared in the newspapers, made him sport's most lovable figure. "Honey, I forgot to duck." However, many sports writers were very critical of Dempsey. They wondered if he had got owed overnight. Had the 3-year layoff affected him, or was Tunney just too good? Some theorised that Dempsey lost because Jack Kearns was not in his corner. Others had conspiracy theories from Dempsey being poisoned before the fight, or that the fight was fixed. Damon Runyon, one of Dempsey's loyalist supporters, was harsh on Dempsey, to the point where he discredited Tunney's outstanding performance. They all go the same way. Another once great champion joined the big parade of the has-beens, the never-ending parade. Dempsey was so badly outboxed and outclassed that toward the end of the bout, he seemed more of a third-rater than one of the greatest champions that ever lived. James Dawson of the New York Times wrote that Tunney was a complete master from the first bell to last. He outboxed and he outfought Dempsey at every turn. All the evidences of the old Dempsey were merely that, only fake evidence, indications, unimpressive flashes, save for their expressions of futility, of hopelessness, of utter ineffectiveness. Dawson went on to basically suggest that Dempsey was an overrated fighter in the first place, beating average guys, and that it was inevitable that someone with brains would eventually beat him, and he wrote that Dempsey fell when he faced his first real opposition from a man who was determined and unafraid and who could fight as well as box. Dawson continued to bash both fighters, saying that Tunney is not really a great fighter. If he was, Dawson argued, he would have knocked out Dempsey. I think in our opinion, we're sure most of our listeners think that probably is a little bit of old pony from Mr. Dawson there. I think he's obviously must have been on one the night that he wrote that article, because he really just giving both of them a hell of a bashing there, isn't he?
He really is, and I think all of them are as well, pretty much. And I think it's just unjust, really. You know, you've got 2 guys that have gone in there and put their lives on the line. Back then they did, even more so than today, and they just love to bash them. It's so vicious at times, but you know, these guys had thick skins, and well, what it did was actually bring them together, because Tunney went to visit Dempsey at his hotel, and he recalled that he told him that, this is Tunney saying this, that I always thought you were a great champion, and I want to say now that you're a first-class opponent and fought as clean a game, a fight, as any man who has been in the ring. Dempsey thanked Tunney and said, "Gene, I'm sorry to lose the title, but I'm glad you were the one to win it from me. I want to wish you every bit of luck and hope you make $1 million out of the title. I mean, these guys brought together with all these arseholes writing shit about it, basically. Well, all the nice words would soon turn, obviously, back to more damaging punches, as talk of a rematch was already beginning to surface. And of course, it all began with that wiry, just very clever promoter in Tex Rickard, who, despite the one-sidedness of the fight, still felt that a rematch was a possibility. And it was actually the sports writers who had already created a list of reasons and excuses as to why Dempsey had lost the fight. So Rickard knew he could capitalize on all those theories. And Dempsey lit the fire when he said, Gene Tunney is the best man I ever fought. But if we ever meet again, I'll beat him. There's no maybe about that either. He's a grand man and a great fighter, but I know I can stop him. Well, on Saturday, September the 26th, Tunney returned to New York to be honoured in his hometown, and thousands turned out, of course, at the Pennsylvania station, accompanied by a motorcycle police escort. The parade headed down 7th Avenue under a blizzard of confetti and through the new champion's Greenwich Village neighborhood before heading eastward to New York City Hall, where the mayor, Jimmy Walker, hosted a brief reception. From City Hall, Tunney's convoy went to the Baltimore Hotel in mid-Manhattan, where a luncheon was arranged by someone called Tim Mara, who, interestingly, had won more than $150,000 on the fight, but would then wind up suing Tunney for a breach of contract at some point. This luncheon was actually held in his honour, where Tunney received several extravagant tributes.
Imagine winning $150,000 on
a fight,
and then suing the guy that you've just put a luncheon on for. I'm not too sure what was going on there. Yeah. Now, during that parade, Tunney publicly alley-bashed the New York State Athletic Commission for not hosting the fight and the negative press towards him. He said 6 years later, I made the error of criticising their attitude towards my victory in a smarty manner. This may have been justified, but it certainly was unwise. Practically overnight, I became the most unpopular of all heavyweight champions. I could have been a more gracious winner. I goaded and gloated, and I deserved what I got. Well, with no challenges on the horizon, Tunney decided that he would take a long break from the ring and probably would not make his first defence until the summer of 1927. However, it would almost be 1 year to the day before he got back in the ring. 2 weeks after their fight, Dempsey and Tunney were reunited at the third and new Madison Square Garden, where they had been invited by Rickard to attend a boxing card. When Dempsey climbed through the ropes to be introduced by Joe Humphreys, he was cheered for more than 2 minutes. He was deeply touched, yet when the new champion, Tunney, a native New Yorker, got into the ring to receive a championship belt from the Metropolitan Boxing Writers Association, he heard far more boos than cheers. Dempsey, standing in the ring with Tunney, felt embarrassed for the new champion, and he said, "That was an outrage. I felt just as badly as Gene did." Tunney later said that he was not totally surprised, knowing that when it came to the heavyweights, most boxing fans preferred aggressive punchers like Dempsey, not the clever boxers like him. For Rickard, the reception Dempsey received convinced him that Dempsey was still boxing's biggest attraction. While away from the ring, Tunney agreed to financially beneficial vaudeville shows, saw a lot of his new girlfriend Polly Lauder, played golf, went on holiday and did some road work and occasional sparring. He also wrote an article for the March 1927 issue of American Legion Monthly in which he defended his reading habits.
That's crazy, defending it. I used to think it was weird that he was a reader because he's a boxer. Well, it's crazy, weird. By mid-April 1927, Dempsey, after 3 months of chopping down trees and doing daily road work and occasional sparring in the Ventura Mountains in Southern California, under the guidance of trainer Gus Wilson, told Rickard he was now ready to return. Harry Wills, who was a potential opponent, had actually lost to the new kid on the block, who was Jack Sharkey. So the threat of Wills was finally put to bed in the press without Dempsey ever actually having to face him. Interesting. Lucky for him. Rickard then announced that he would match Dempsey against the winner of Sharkey and another guy called Jimmy Maloney. Dempsey and Tunney, well, they were among the crowd of the 40,000 that witnessed Sharkey win easily. Rickard then announced that Sharkey and Dempsey would meet at the Yankee Stadium on July 21st with the winner to fight Gene Tunney. Dempsey hired a new manager for the Sharkey fight, Leo Flynn, a veteran who had managed several heavyweights including Bill Brennan. Billy Duff, a veteran manager, trainer, nightclub owner and a convicted felon, also joined Dempsey as a third trainer. 19 days before the Sharkey fight, Dempsey received a shocking phone call. His brother Johnny, a recovering heroin addict who tried to reconcile with his wife, had killed her and himself when she refused to return west with him to be with their 2-year-old son. Dempsey, of course, was devastated by the news, but decided to keep training and continue with the Sharkey fight. 80,000 turned out to watch Dempsey knock out Sharkey in 7 rounds, and this is what the former champ recalled in his autobiography. He said, "I shot in 2 low punches. Sharkey, instead of claiming foul, turned his head as if to complain to the referee, leaving himself wide open. I delivered a left to the jaw and he kissed the canvas. I was proclaimed the winner. Leo grinned from ear to ear. Bucky's face, as in Sharkey's manager, was dark as I helped Sharkey back to his corner."
The verdict on whether the punches were legal or not was split among sports writers, but there were no complaints by Sharkey, who said, "It's all in the game." Tunney sat ringside and was impressed with Dempsey's showing, and he said, "His punches were short, but they were snappy and forceful. I might even say that I never saw Dempsey in a better fight." Tex Rickard was also happy. The fight produced another gate of over $1 million, the largest ever for a non-title match. Rickard got both Dempsey and Tunney to agree to a rematch on September the 22nd at Soldier Field, a coliseum in Grant Park, Chicago, along Lake Michigan, that could hold 160,000 spectators. Rickard ruled out New York because of the cost of the ringside seats and because Yankee Stadium could not match Soldier Field in capacity. Plus, because the New York State License Committee had denied Dempsey a license to fight in New York when arranging the first fight. Tunney had received a hero's welcome when he arrived in Chicago in early September. He was asked about the up-and-coming fight. Tunney smiled and said, "If there is to be a fight, I know nothing of it. I don't like fighting, but I do like boxing, and as far as I know, this is going to be a boxing contest." Tunney set up camp at the new Cedar Crest Country Club in Lake Villa, 52 miles from the heart of Chicago's downtown. Dempsey arrived earlier in mid-August and went straight to training. His base was in Lincoln Fields, a racing facility in Crete, Illinois, about 35 miles from Chicago. The press watched both spar and reported that Dempsey looked slow and clearly on the decline, whereas Tunney, he looked great and seemed to be improving.
So by mid-September, Tex Rickard was actually assured of an unprecedented $2 million gate. By then, more than 100,000 tickets had been sold, including most of the $40 ringside seats. During the 1920s, Chicago was mobbed up, so rumours of a fix were not surprising. The main gangster was, of course, Al Capone, who had made his wager after hearing that Dave Miller, a well-regarded referee who ran a speakeasy, was going to be named as the referee for the fight, and that Miller's brother had waged heavily on Dempsey. Thinking there might be a connection, Al Capone bet on Dempsey too. Years later, Ed Sullivan, who covered Dempsey's camp for the New York Daily News, wrote that 5 of Capone's henchmen had turned up at Dempsey's training site and said Capone was prepared to have the right man referee the fight if Dempsey's brain trust paid a fee of $50,000. That, of course, was a lot less than the $1 million Rothstein and Abe Attell had allegedly offered to Gene Tunney to throw the fight. Dempsey, though, made an honest point that it was highly unlikely that he would outpoint Tunney. He said, "I've got to rely on these," and Dempsey held up his fists. Dempsey then sent Capone a handwritten note asking him to back off and let the fight go on in a sportsmanlike and honest fashion. The next day, Stell actually received a huge bouquet of flowers with a note that said, "To the Dempseys in the name of sportsmanship." The note was unsigned, but Dempsey had a pretty good idea of who sent the flowers. Now, because of the rumours about a fix by either Al Capone or Rothstein and Abertel, Dempsey's camp began to worry about his food and his drinks. To make sure there would be no tampering with anything on Dempsey's menu, Leo Flynn brought in his wife, Catherine, to do all the cooking.
An open letter was then sent to the Chicago Herald-Examiner that alleged Tunney had conspired with Billy Gibson and Boo Boo Hoff to fix the first fight in Philadelphia, referring to the second contract that Tunney had threw at his manager before the first fight. Dempsey clearly never wrote the letter and probably didn't even know anything about it, but Tunney responded to the allegations with his own open letter and said, "It's evident trash completely." Tunney went on to say he thought the Dempsey letter was a very cheap appeal for public sympathy, and added a postscript which read, "I might add that I wrote this letter myself." Right up until the opening bell of the rematch, suspicions remained about whether the fight was to be fixed or not. The referee was not to be picked until just before the bout was due to start, so that mobsters would have a difficult time getting to the referee in time to bribe him, or the judges for that matter. Dempsey's manager, Leo Flynn, then insisted that the referee for the fight, to enforce the rule of a fighter scoring a knockdown, must return to a neutral corner in the event of a knockdown. That rule would be implemented for the fight and would make a big impression on the rematch. By the morning of the fight, the betting was at even money, and at some betting establishments, Dempsey was a slight favourite because of a heavy influx of money placed on him by many of his supporters who arrived from the west of Chicago and Colorado. Once again, like the first fight, anyone made the trip to Chicago to witness the fight. It was more of an attraction than the first, which took some doing to surpass. Hollywood stars, gangsters, politicians, royalty, sporting stars, you name it, they were there, as were your average Joes.
Rubbing shoulders with them all. The night of the fight was chilly and overcast with a temperature in the mid-50s. A light rain fell early in the evening, completely nothing like their first fight in Philadelphia. This one would be fought in dry weather. But 6 referees, interestingly, sat ringside for the evening, as obviously all the undercards went underway. But none of the 6, according to Illinois Athletic Commission Chairman John Riegermeyer, knew who would be chosen by the commission to handle the main event, the Dempsey-Tunney fight, until one remained seated once the co-main event began. That guy happened to be the referee, who was Dave Barry. Once again, Graham McNamee of the National Broadcasting Company had been hooked up of 74 stations, and whose broadcast, it was said later by NBC officials, had been heard by more than 50 million people in the United States and Canada, and a dozen of other countries in Europe and Latin America. The 32-year-old Jack Dempsey was now 58, 5 and 9. He entered the ring first in a white robe with the initials JD on the front and wearing black trunks to a huge ovation. Then several minutes later, who was 2 years younger than Dempsey and with a record of 78, 1 and 3, entered to a far more subdued reception wearing his scarlet and blue robe with the Marine Corps logo on the back. When Tunney climbed through the ropes, he relaxed. Jack Dempsey turned to him and said, "How are you, Gene?" "Quite well, Jack. And you?" Started having a meeting, a chat. That's what Tunney replied with a smile before walking to his corner, appearing calm and collected. Now, following the introductions, Jim Corbett, Jack Johnson, Benny Leonard, Jim Jeffries, Battling Nelson, and several other past and present champions all entered the ring. For their introductions, Dave Barry was introduced now as the referee, and 2 wealthy Chicago businessmen in George Linton and Sheldon Clark were named as the 2 judges.
When the 2 fighters met in the middle of the ring for the instructions, Barry said in a clear, forceful voice, "In the event of a knockdown, the man scoring the knockdown must go to the farthest neutral corner." "Is that clear, Jack?" Barry asked Dempsey. He nodded in agreement. Turning to Tunney, Barry repeated his question. "Is that clear, champ?" Tunney nodded. "Now, in the event of a knockdown, unless the boy scoring it goes to the farthest corner, I will not begin the count until he does." Barry said, "Is that clear, Jack?" "Yes," Dempsey replied. "Is that clear, champ?" Tunney again nodded in approval. Barry also stressed that both rabbit and kidney punches, for which Dempsey was notorious for, were forbidden. Both Dempsey and Tunney again nodded in affirmation. "Good luck to you both," Barry finally said, while waving the fighters to their corners. So now we again move in to the fight, the rematch. Now Dempsey charged Tunney in the first round to the delight of his fans, who, it soon became evident, vastly outnumbered Tunney's supporters. Dempsey's strategy was to force Tunney to fight at close quarters and to pound his crushing uppercuts to the body, forcing Tunney to lower his guard so Dempsey could unleash his powerful left hook or a right cross to the jaw. Unlike in the first fight, Tunney stood his ground and either tied up the onrushing Dempsey or met his attacks with sharp left jabs to the head or swift left-right combinations. When Tunney did attack, he drove Dempsey back to the ropes. Dempsey constantly stalked Tunney, bobbing and weaving his head tucked in, making his chin a difficult target, while Tunney peppered the former champion with lightning-fast punches and then danced away, usually to the left, making it more difficult for Dempsey to hit him with his left hook or clinching when he felt in any danger. But it was during the clinches that Dempsey did most of his damage, albeit illegally, with rabbit punches. He was not warned by the referee, Barry.
After he just given him literally early in the fight, still ain't warning him. Rounds 3 to 6, and as in Philadelphia, the pattern was the same, with Tunney in just complete control, appearing to clearly win the first 5 rounds. And Dempsey was slow with his punches, but fought better than he had in the first fight. He landed a few punches during the first 5 rounds, but they seemed to have just no impact, little impact on Tunney. The champion, by contrast, jolted and hurt Dempsey several times in the early rounds, particularly in the fourth, when he staggered Dempsey with a left-right combination to the head and then 2 sharp rights to the jaw. By the end of the round, Dempsey needed both a dose of smelling salts and repair work on his cut under the right eye. Dempsey did finally get in a good left hook, which shook Tunney momentarily midway through the 5th, but Tunney responded with several sharp rights to the head as he continued to outbox and outslug Dempsey. At the end of the 5th round, Sergeant Bill Smith, one of 2 Chicago police officers who had been assigned as bodyguards to Tunney, became so agitated over Dempsey's rabbit punches that he leaped onto the apron of the ring where the referee, Dave Barry, was standing and screamed at him, "You son of a bitch, if you don't stop those rabbit punches, you'll be carried out of here dead." Dempsey seemed to have slowed down, but appeared to have an edge in the 6th, when he ripped half a dozen punishing hooks to Tunney's body. But by the 7th round, it was evident to even the most loyal Dempsey fan that time was running out for the former champion. Seemingly, it would take a miracle for the tiring Dempsey to beat his unmarked boxing champion, who seemed to know when and where every punch was coming from.
Now moving into that 7th round, and the mood changed. It changed dramatically. The mood of this fight changed, which is still recalled as not only the most memorable round in boxing history, but among the most controversial episodes ever in sport. Now, less than a minute into the round, as Tunney began to shoot another left jab at Dempsey, the challenger beat him to the punch with a roundhouse right that caught Tunney on the left side of his head and knocked him off balance. Instantly, Dempsey followed that blow with a crushing left hook that sent Tunney reeling into the ropes just to the left of Dempsey's corner. With Tunney helpless and obviously hurt, Dempsey pounced, firing 5 lightning-fast left and right hand punches to the head, the last 2 or 3 which landed as Tunney began to slowly sink to the canvas, almost as if in slow motion, before landing on his back. Dazed as he was, Tunney somehow had the presence of mind to grasp the middle rope with his left hand and in a matter of seconds pull himself up to a sitting position. Graham McNamee screamed down his microphone, "Tunney is down! Tunney is down!" from a barrage of lefts and rights to the face. It looked as though Dempsey's pre-fight prediction that he would win by knockout in about 7 rounds seemed realistic. Describing the scene, James Dawson in the New York Times wrote, Satiety's blue bloods forgot decorum and yelled excitedly. Kings of finance and princes of industry were mingling their yells with those of governors, mayors, representatives in Congress, senators, lawyers, doctors, theatre and movie folk, and just plain ordinary people. Over a 12-year professional boxing career that had comprised of 75 fights and a grand total of 488 rounds, Tunney had never been knocked off his feet. As soon as Tunney landed on the floor, Barry prepared to start a count, but then realised that Dempsey was standing against the ropes within a few feet of Tunney.
To continue this seventh, Barry called out to Dempsey to go across to the ring to a neutral corner, but either because of the crowd's noise or his own personal confusion, Dempsey did not move. Finally, Barry, turning away from Tunney, screamed at Dempsey and succeeded in waving him to the furthest neutral corner. As soon as Tunney hit the floor, the timekeeper Paul Beeler, whose job it was to begin counting as soon as the fighter was knocked down, began a verbal count which had reached 4, some suggest, by the time Tunney had rightened himself into that sitting position on the floor. Ignoring Beeler's count, Barry began his own. 1, 2. Tunney claimed later he was convinced from the time he heard Barry count 2 that he could have got up, but also realised it was in his best interest to stay down and regain his faculties until the count got to at least 9. As Barry called out 9, Tunney bounced to his feet and Dempsey charged at him, going for the kill. Considering how badly he had hurt Tunney, and with almost 2 minutes still left of the round, most Dempsey supporters were virtually certain that he would knock out Tunney, who somehow managed to retreat and clinch for the remainder of the round. If Dempsey was frustrated that he couldn't land on the elusive Tunney, his supporters were even more enraged, as they were actually heard by some people shouting, "Stand up and fight, you yellow coward," bellowed one guy, and "Fight, you son of a bitch," screamed another. Finally, in frustration, Dempsey actually stopped in his tracks, dropped his gloves to his side, and then waved Tunney with his left glove to come forward before muttering, "Come on and fight, you son of a bitch." Late in the round, Tunney had recovered and fought back, landing several good combinations in succession. Just before the bell, Tunney actually rocked Dempsey with a right to the chest, which Dempsey later recalled was the hardest blow I had ever received. "I thought I was going to die after that punch. I couldn't get my breath."
Now moving past that infamous round to rounds 8 to 10, and by that 8th round it was obvious that Dempsey was spent. Refreshed after his minute rest in the corner, Tunney seemed totally rejuvenated. In total control and easily eluding Dempsey's wild swing, Tunney dropped Dempsey with a right to the head midway through the round, the one and only time he would knock down Dempsey over 20 rounds. Interestingly, Barry immediately began a count before Tunney had even had a chance to head for the neutral corner. But it didn't matter, as before Barry reached 2, Dempsey jumped up. For the remainder of the 8th round and over the last 2, Dempsey, slow and tired, pursued Tunney doggedly, but never came close to landing an effective punch, while Tunney pummeled him repeatedly with snapping left jabs that opened a second cut near Dempsey's left eye. Out of frustration, Dempsey wrestled Tunney to the floor early in the 10th and final round, with his face a bloody mess after being battered around the ring with swift punches to the head. As the final bell sounded, McNamee said into his microphone, "It is all over and Dempsey is practically out on his feet. I think there is no question now who the champion is." The announcement was that Tunney had retained his title and was greeted with as many boos as cheers from the crowd. In the ring, Tunney spoke to NBC and said, "Hello everybody. It was a real contest all the way through. I want to say hello to all my friends in Connecticut and elsewhere. Thank you." Apart from the 7th round, the fight had been another one-sided performance from Tunney, but would forever be remembered for that pivotal 7th round knockdown and its alleged long count. Damon Runyon wrote that because of the long count, arguments are bound to ring through the fistic world. He wasn't wrong.
Oh boy, wasn't he wrong. Nat Fleischer, who clocked Tunney as having been on the deck for 14 seconds apparently, went on to point out that by his count, Tunney had landed almost twice as many punches as Dempsey did, and 3 times as many over the last 2 rounds. Immediately after the fight, Flynn announced that he would he'd file an appeal with the Illinois Athletic Commission, asking it to reverse the decision. Dempsey said in his dressing room right after the fight, and this is what he said right after the fight: intentionally or otherwise, I was robbed of the championship in the 7th round. Tunney was down for the count of 14 or 15. Every stopwatch around the ring caught the time as about 15 seconds, and the inefficiency of the referee or the timekeeper or both deprived me of the fight. Everybody knows I am the winner. When Tunney beat me last year, I admitted that he was the better man that night. I am not an alibi artist, but I know down in my soul that I knocked Tunney out tonight, and what's more, chased him all around the ring and should have won on points at least. Asked if he wanted to fight Tunney again, Dempsey actually replied, "You bet your life. I beat Tunney tonight and I'll beat him again anytime he wants to get into the same ring with me. I am not ready to retire by a long shot. Not before I have had another crack at Tunney." Tunney said just a few hours after the fight, "I have boasted that fellow for 8 long years, but it's all over now. He hit me below the belt on several occasions and he butted me with his head like a goat. In the clinches, he twisted my arm and was apparently trying to wrench or break them by bending them backward. And those rabbit punches kept banging the base of my skull."
Once Dempsey calmed down, he did have a different perspective several hours after the fight, and he said, "There's not much for me to say except that I was beaten again tonight by a man who demonstrated beyond all question of doubt that he is the better man. I felt in the 7th that the championship had come back to me, that I had shattered that old stuff, that they can't come back. I take my hat off to him. He's a real champion, worthy of the name and title." Estimates of how long Tunney had been down ranged from 14 to 18 seconds. More importantly, the question is whether Tunney could have gotten up before the count of 10 had Dempsey immediately gone to a neutral corner. Days after the fight, Tunney said on several occasions that he had not become aware of the referee's count until he had reached 2, which was after he had been down for at least 6 seconds and possibly longer. The tape suggests to us that if this was the case, then Tunney probably could have gotten up before 10, but would he have been able to survive the onslaught from Dempsey? That's another question that we'll never be able to get the answer to. Well, that pretty much concludes right there the saga, the legacy, the legendary night that is Jack Dempsey and Gene Tunney, because after this fight in particular, they both went on to retire. So there is no aftermath to go through because they both retired after this particular fight. And I suppose before we end the episode, all thoughts point to this long count, the long count fight. It's very historical, it's very infamous. But the biggest thing I take away from this whole thing is what was important to put into context before we went through the fight description for the rematch was what the referee was saying about the rules of the fight. He will not start the count until the fighter that scored the knockdown is in the neutral corner. Jack Dempsey wasn't in the neutral corner, hence the reason why the count didn't start. So whether Tunney's been down 5-6 seconds or not, by the timekeeper's ring count, it's the referee making that decision about that fighter being in the neutral corner that matters. And we've had it recently, haven't we, with Tyson Fury, Deontay Wilder, their first fight. Tyson Fury goes down, Deontay Wilder dances around the ring for a few seconds but doesn't go to the neutral corner. By the time he gets to the neutral corner and the referee Jack Rice starts his count, Tyson Fury does get them extra couple of seconds to recover. No matter how many stopwatches you put against this, it is the rules of boxing, the rules that were specifically outlined before the fight started. So to me, the whole myth behind it all is not a myth. The rules were the rules. The rules were put into place. They were made very clear to both men who confirmed they knew the rules of the fight. And ultimately, Jack Dempsey was his own worst enemy because he beat himself because he didn't go to that neutral corner.
Yeah, and I think that from that statement right at the end there with Jack is pretty clear, isn't it? Pretty, yeah, he's very frustrated and he's very annoyed with himself because, one thing when you watch all the Jack Dempsey tapes, when you watch all the other fights before the Tunney fights, is he does stand over his opponents. The Furpo fight, I mean, he just stands over him every time he gets. It was a crazy how these guys ever managed to get back on their feet. See it with other fighters before, but that is the absolute. He was his own worst enemy. He should have backed off to a neutral corner, and he didn't do that. And I mean, the other thing is, even if he did, I think the other point is that Gene Tunney's always said by the time he heard the referees count get to 2, his head was clear. So, I mean, even if it did get to 6 or 8, he probably could have got up at 9. I think the biggest problem is, I mean, how great is 8 seconds in boxing? I mean, 8, it's a big deal. I mean, 8 seconds. If you get an extra 8 seconds to clear your head against someone like Dempsey, I think maybe that helped him. But again, the rules were clear. Dempsey didn't do what he was supposed to do. So, the famous long count. I mean, there's no other way to end this on this precise moment, in it, Sean. I mean, there's no reason to get everyone else's sort of descriptions and opinions because it doesn't really matter. You can read several. I think for us, it's. I think Dempsey's let himself down. If he had have just returned to a neutral corner, I think Tunney gets up, but I think he probably has a chance of putting him down again at least. So yeah, it's his own fault, mate. It was, wasn't it? But what a great tale, though. My goodness.
Brilliant story. I've really thoroughly enjoyed telling the story of this. There's a lot of information that leads into the build up to the first fight and a lot of context as to how their careers intertwined and eventually became on that collision course. And the one thing that you take away from this really is that Gene Tunney, how underrated as a heavyweight champion is he?
Yes.
He beats Jack Dempsey, one of the guys that is considered to be one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. But yet Gene Tunney doesn't really get a say in the matter when it comes down to your top 10s and your top 20s. Gene Tunney doesn't really get spoken about. And what this has shown for me from the evidence that we've sourced for this episode is that Gene Tunney needs to be regarded as one of the great heavyweight champions of all time. Okay, so he does retire after the rematch. They both retire. Gene Tunney goes on, he becomes a American light heavyweight champion, moves up to heavyweight, wins the world heavyweight title, defends it successfully regardless of what you think about the long count, and then retires. So he doesn't have a long resume after this point. What does that matter? How can you not regard him as one of the great heavyweight champions of all time if he beats the man who was considered the man at the time? Because first, before Jack Dempsey, it was Jack Johnson. So Jack Johnson gets succeeded by Jack Dempsey, who then gets succeeded by Joe Louis. But Gene Tunney doesn't get mentioned in that mix, does he? And that's the disappointment of it all, really. And I hope that what this episode has done for you as listeners is that it actually has highlighted how good of a fighter Gene Tunney was and how much respect needs put into his name as a fighter, especially for those that have not really heard too much about his life and times. And it's why we want to do career profiles again on both of these fighters. Jack Dempsey will be the first one we do cover very shortly. It will be our next career profile. But Gene Tunney absolutely deserves a career profile. There are more stories which we purposely omissed from this episode, knowing that we are going to bring more stories for their respective career profiles. So it is very exciting to be able to go into more of the detail of some of these other fights that we've not mentioned and some of the other stories that happened inside and outside of the ring. But overall, Johnston, it's been a really great tale, a real bumper episode, a fantastic finale, and overall a brilliant season.
The one thing I will say is one thing that annoys me about this era is, how highly regarded. I mean, Gene Tunney, I think he's just a gentleman. And I love those guys that are vicious in the ring and a great boxer and very articulate and a gentleman. And I like that he's very sportsmanlike, that Marine really installed into him. But one thing is, we've spoke about him several times, is Harry Wills. I mean, if you could have stuck a Dempsey, Tunney, Harry Wills, and like even an aged Sam Langford, I mean, them 4, and even like a Sam McVeigh at the time, them 5 fighters in the heavyweight, if they had fought at some point, I mean, obviously the 3 black guys, they just didn't get a look in, and I think that's the one thing that really always pisses me off with these episodes is. You rightly mentioned Gene Tunney doesn't get mentioned. I don't think he ever fought a black fighter as well about Gene, which is a bit disappointing for me. But it was almost like it's like two different. Who was better? We will never know, and I think that's what really frustrates me out of the whole thing. Although it's a great tale, some great little stories in there. They both had some tragedies in their lives as well, and then they come to meet and how they sort of in the end become friends. I like that. Yeah, I mean, look, it was a great story. It was fantastic. It was a bumper one. I mean, it's almost like too many career profiles and then meeting up into this fight. But we felt we needed to do it. You know, these two, we have never done anything before, Sean. So it's been a privilege, hasn't it, mate, to be able to do this.
It's been a privilege and a pleasure, and as I've said before, a great way to end season 3. There's been a lot of historical tales throughout the course of the season, and we felt this one would top the lot of them, being the finale episode of the season. So if you have enjoyed this episode in particular, please do let us know on Twitter at Legend Night Pod, or at the BTR Boxing Podcast Network Facebook page, or if you're watching / listening on YouTube, drop a comment in the box below. If you're on Instagram, make sure you are giving us a follow on that platform as well, and any comments, any thoughts, feelings and opinions on this particular tale, or if you've got any thoughts on the season overall. We will be doing a wrap-up episode as we always do, so if you have any thoughts on the overall season, the 10 episodes that we've put out there, please let us know. And also let us know if there are any fights that you do want us to cover for future seasons. We don't really put many requests out there anymore, but we would like to hear from you and like to hear whether you'd like us to include certain fights for next year's Legendary Night season. Please do let us know. And a big shout out to the patrons of the podcast. Thank you so much for your support as always, and your support has allowed us to outsource the artwork for this particular season. I know it doesn't always appear on everybody's podcast feed, but if you do go and check it out on the majority of them, you can actually see the brilliant artwork that's been put on there to represent all of these episodes, and it's because of you patrons that we've been able to do that. So a big thank you to you guys as well. And that's it, fight fans. Thank you so much for listening to the tale of Jack Dempsey and Gene Tunney.